Good morning. I think we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. It's such a beautiful day outside. Thank you all for making this a priority this morning. For those of you who I have not met yet, my name is Gina Berg, and I'm CEO at Rocky Mountain MS Center. On behalf of our board of directors, staff, physicians, and volunteers, I'd like to welcome you here today. We're pleased to have you with us this morning at the Anschutz Medical Campus, which is home to our neurologists and clinical staff. This is our second Education Summit on campus, and we couldn't be happier to be here sharing the latest on MS research and our philosophy right from where the research is happening. I'd like to take a moment to give special thanks to our online viewers. We have quite a few this morning. We're excited about the technical advances that continue to help us bring cutting-edge presentations to you. We've had hundreds of people sign up to watch live streaming today from all over the United States. We've got folks from California to Wyoming, from Michigan down to Florida, all the way up to Maine. We even have folks from Canada and Australia with us today. So although they're not in the room, welcome and thanks for joining us. Our Education Summit allows us to bring you the latest news on research and treatments on MS, bring you information about important topics related to living with MS, and gives us an opportunity to interact with our medical staff outside of regular doctor appointments. Very important note, I'd like to take a moment to thank our exhibitors who are here today with us. AbbVie, Acorda Therapeutics, Biogen, Sanofi Genzyme, Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation, Teva Neuroscience, and Genentech. We're able to bring you the Education Summit thanks only to their generous support. So please take a moment to visit their booths and tell them thank you. I'd like to introduce to you Carrie Chahovic. She's our Director of Programs at the MS Center. One of Carrie's primary roles is to serve as liaison between the MS Center's nonprofit and hospital staffs. Today she's also going to be serving as our MC. Carrie.
Thanks so much, Gina, and thank you all so much for being here again. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces too. I would like to echo what Gina said and welcome everyone to the University of Colorado Hospital. It's great to be here on campus again and here at the hospital, which is such an important part of what we do at the MS Center. The unique collaboration between the University of Colorado Hospital, and our nonprofit, the Rocky Mountain MS Center, really leverages the expertise of researchers, clinicians, and care providers here on campus with the support and education services offered by the Rocky Mountain MS Center. And our partnership allows us to help meet the needs of the MS community throughout the Rocky Mountain region. At every summit that I've been a part of, I am truly always amazed by how much I learn, both from these presentations and from all of you, whether it's conversations during the break or before the event, or the insightful questions that you all ask. So thank you again. We really hope that this is an empowering experience for all of you. We have a full schedule today. Dr. Terry Schreiner will be kicking off our presentations, followed by a segment with nurse practitioner Shannon Cornell on what wellness means to the Rocky Mountain MS Center. And we're very pleased to welcome Holly Pren, a registered dietitian at UC Health's Integrative Medicine Center, discussing nutrition and MS. We'll then have a short break, followed by presentations from the co-directors of the Rocky Mountain MS Center at CU, Drs. Tim Vollmer and John Corboy, and the newest neurologist on our team, Dr. Robert Gross. We will end the day with a question and answer session. Just a few logistics before we kick off our presentations. Please do silence or power down your mobile devices. Restrooms are located outside the auditorium and down the short hallway, so you can just head out the rear doors behind you. You hopefully received a couple of note cards when you checked in this morning. Those are to write down any questions that you have for presenters, so be sure to write down questions as they come up for you. We'll also have volunteers circulating to pass out note cards in case you didn't get those, and also collecting those at the end of each row, so be sure to pass them down. Do note that for note taking, there are small fold-up desks to your right, so if that's helpful for you, just know they're there. And I would like to call your attention to the evaluation form, an incredibly important piece of information in your packet today. We really rely on your evaluations and feedback to help inform our summits and tell us what you'd like to see. So please take the time to fill those out and give those to us at the end of the program. There's a box on the registration table. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Terry Schreiner, who will talk about, does what I do matter? Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Okay. All right, good morning. Can you all hear me okay? No. Okay. Maybe I need to pull this a bit closer. How about now? A little better? Okay. I'll try and project as well. So, good morning. We're so excited that you are here. I'm so excited to see several faces in the audience of patients, people that I know, family members, and it's my particular pleasure to kick off the morning with a discussion of does what I do matter? And I think we can all sort of recognize as we go into today, maybe anticipating more information, maybe thinking about some changes we can make in our own lives, the importance of does what I do matter? We want to make sure that everything that we choose to spend our time on in life is something that is going to make a difference in some way. Now, you may already be making changes in your life. The question is still pertinent. Are what you do on a daily basis, is that making a difference? And if you are sort of in the stages of contemplating a change in your life, I think you can recognize as well, you want to make a change that you know is going to matter in your life. So we'll start today by talking about the problem. Like, well, is there a problem? Is there a problem with with choosing tasks and goals in our life, and how we choose them, what the evidence is for what we choose, how we do it, and what are the tools that help us to make these changes, to get to a better place where we know that what we are doing matters. Now, I've put up here some examples of the problem. So we all have so many demands on our time, and choosing what to do means that we need to not do other things. So among what I call the sea of shoulds, all of the shoulds, should change the oil, should manage our 401k, balance the checkbook, mop the floor, whatever. Among all of the shoulds, including the shoulds that pertain to multiple sclerosis, how do you choose when there's so many things demanding our time? And we have some guidance. We know that we can prioritize the shoulds based on a couple different things, maybe the first of which is the immediacy. Like, I know I am not going to get to the Rocky Mountain MS Center Educational Summit if I do not stop and put gas in my car. That's an immediacy. We know we need to do that. We need to put aside something else in order to achieve a particular goal. I don't know about you, but I know I prioritize my shoulds based on how difficult they are. Not only because doing difficult things like taxes is onerous, but because if we only have a short amount of time, we might not want to choose that most difficult task, and rather put that off to another time. And the sense of reward or accomplishment that we get with choosing different tasks, different endeavors in our life. For example, the laundry. We know that doing the laundry, at least if you're like me, is not a fun task. But there is a reward of clean clothing that comes from doing that, which can feed us as we choose how to prioritize the shoulds in our life. Not the least of which that helps us to prioritize the shoulds is how the shoulds resonate with our values. And I've put up a very simple example. I value a clean car. Therefore, I will go to the car wash to get a clean car. I will invest that time and the energy to get to a different place, a place that I value, a better place. And then there is the belief that whatever we are doing is worth it. And that is really the crux of what we're going to talk about this morning, is the worth. How do you determine whether or not what you are choosing to do is worth it? Well, we know there are a couple things that help to guide us here. I am going to share with you some quantitative evidence, some data, some of what we know about the why you should make a change in your life, why to prioritize some of the MS shoulds. But that's not the only thing that helps us determine worth. We know that the worth of an item that we're considering purchasing is not just the value, but also how much joy we think it's going to bring to us, what it is valued by other people as well. We know that there's a human element to things. And so we're going to talk a little bit about qualitative data that helps us determine worth. And those two things together, I hope, will convince you that yes, among the MS shoulds, it is worth it. So here we have the MS shoulds. These are the things that we're going to talk about briefly in the next couple minutes, and then things that you'll hear about throughout the rest of the morning from my colleagues. We should exercise. We know there's so many reasons to exercise. I'm going to tell you some more that are specific to multiple sclerosis. We should eat a healthy diet, a low-salt diet. I'm going to convince you that it does matter to eat a healthy and low-salt diet. Take vitamin D. Take a disease-modifying therapy. We actually have very good evidence that this is a should for most people, and we'll talk about that. And lastly, stop smoking. And this is, if this were an easy thing, we wouldn't be talking about it. It's hard, but it is a really important thing that if you are a smoker, you can do to improve your health. So let's start with exercise. We know that there's so many different benefits to exercise. The ones that we hear about the most are cardiovascular fitness, weight loss, endurance. We know that there are effects on diabetes when you exercise, positive effects. We know that it can lower blood pressure. We know also in multiple sclerosis that there are very particular benefits that you get in addition to all of those other benefits. They still pertain. But what I'd like to highlight this morning in terms of why to exercise if you have multiple sclerosis is the effects that exercise has on fatigue. Now, fatigue is one of the most prevalent and troublesome symptoms of multiple sclerosis. It can, and unfortunately often does, influence what you choose to do during a day, what you're able to do. And there are many different things contributing to MS fatigue. Now, on the top of the panel here, you'll see what we call the primary MS fatigue. These are causes of fatigue that come from the biologic processes of multiple sclerosis. We have neurodegeneration here, leading to central nervous system changes. We have inflammation that contributes to fatigue. And we have endocrine changes here. All of these are biologic processes that contribute to MS fatigue, primary MS fatigue. And what we see here in the middle of the diagram is exercise. Exercise can positively influence each of these three different broad categories of biologic triggers of primary MS fatigue. It does make a difference. What we see in the bottom part of the diagram here are the secondary things that contribute to MS fatigue. We know that poor sleep, well, if you're not sleeping well at night, of course you're not going to be feeling energetic and awake in the day. We know that depression is a cause of fatigue, very proven and also related to hormones and neurotransmitter secretion in our bodies. These, along with aerobic capacity and strength, are all things that exercise, again here, can positively influence. So all of these discrete contributors to fatigue can be improved through regular exercise. Now I'd like to bring sort of the human element and share a story of one of my patients, Candace, who is 21 years old when she had her first MS exacerbation. And it was a bad one. Now, she was in college at the time. She was working. She was a very, active, busy person who suddenly developed a very severe hemiplegia. So severe that she was in the hospital for a month. She received several different acute treatments, was then in rehabilitation, learning to perform her activities of daily life again to recover from this hemiplegia. And during that time, she was deconditioned from being in the sick or the recovery period, not sick period, for so long, from having decreased activity. She gained weight and she was so exhausted like a lead blanket was laying her down every day. So as a result of all of these, she dropped out of school, just was not able to, let alone get herself there and to pay attention and to perform in her classwork. She cut back on her work and continued and accelerated her physical therapy program. Now, it took a while, but over the first year, she learned how to raise her arm against gravity. Over the next year, she got even stronger and now had some use of that arm, was walking more readily, continuing physical therapy throughout all this time, and then taking what she had gained from physical therapy and transitioning it into an exercise program. And now I'm happy to say she is a kickboxer, yes. So this woman with significant burden of disease at onset has worked to a place where she is not only exercising, not only regained her strength, but choosing to use that strength in a kickboxing class that involves some really significant punching, kicking, and other things that I am not coordinated enough to do. But it does happen, and she now has lost weight, is more energetic, is back in school. So that's one success story showing that it does matter. Exercise does matter. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is your diet. And I've mentioned already how important your diet is to multiple sclerosis. We're going to highlight two aspects of that are really important. One is called the microbiome. A microbiota refers to the bacteria that are in our gut. And then we'll talk a little bit about salt. So your microbiota, the bacteria in your gut, produce molecules that tell your immune system whether or not to be pro-inflammatory, to go out, destroy things, attack, or to be a little bit more measured in the approach. Hey now, let's not overreact. Let's think about whether or not we need an attack here. One of the ways in which it does this is through something called butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid, that by secreting butyrate then sends signals that calm down your immune system. Okay, well, you may be asking, why are you telling me about all these bacteria in my gut? The reason is that what you eat directly influences the type of bacteria that you have in your gut, which then influences whether or not the signals coming from your gut are pro-inflammatory, meaning signals that can cause more MS problems, or regulatory, which advocate for a more tempered immune system. Now, salt is something that we talk about, at least briefly in each visit, because there is some evidence that your salt intake also can contribute to whether or not your immune system goes in a pro-inflammatory attack mode or whether or not it is more regulated. So I've included up here a couple different studies. First, studies that recognize that in a Petri dish that had T cells in it, T lymphocytes, part of our immune system, if you add salt to those T cells, they become inflammatory. I like to think of them as angry. They go into attack mode. That was observed first. The salt made T cells behave differently. Then studies were done in mice, and we found that mice with MS who had a salty diet did worse. And then, most important to us, the studies have correlated that humans with MS who eat a salty diet tend to have more radiologic activity, more changes on the MRI, as well as an increased relapse rate. And this slide here highlights some of the data that came from that more recent study in humans. But I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom part, the part in red, which shows that the relapse rate, 3.95 times that of someone on a low salt diet when they're on a high salt diet. Let me rephrase that. So the relapse rate is directly correlated to how much salt you have in your diet. It does matter. And unfortunately, as Americans, we have far more salt in our diet than we need. So there you see the World Health Organization recommending not to exceed 2 grams of salt per day, but the average American diet has between 4 and 5. So again, it does matter. Here's another story. So Peter has relapsing and remitting multiple sclerosis and has had it for 15 years. He's been treated with different medications and has been taking them with good adherence, but nonetheless has struggled with fatigue, poor sleep, decreased stamina, and weight gain. He's tried several diets for the purposes of weight loss, and it hasn't really worked out for him. More recently, tried the Mediterranean diet, a diet that is documented to have positive effects in cardiovascular health. He was successful in this. He has lost weight, had improved stamina, and now is able to participate more fully in his life. Next, we'll talk about vitamin D. So many studies have been done trying to elucidate the interaction vitamin D has with our immune system. But what we know from the very outset of this is that your vitamin D level changes with the amount of sun that you are exposed to. And so on this world map here, we see the areas in red are the areas with least sun converted into vitamin D. So those are levels, areas in the world that have low vitamin D. Not because there isn't sun there, but because of the angle of the sun and the Earth's rotation and things that make it more difficult to absorb sun in a way that produces vitamin D in those areas. So we see that there are areas with known low vitamin D levels, and that led to studies trying to understand how vitamin D and MS might be linked together, because those are areas that also have high MS rates. So we know that in the mouse model that high vitamin D correlates with a better course of disease. We know that low vitamin D levels are associated with a higher risk of getting MS in the first place. Low vitamin D levels are associated with a high risk of progression to MS. The converse is that high vitamin D levels are associated with a lower risk of MS. And if you already have MS, then low vitamin D levels are associated with a higher relapse rate and MRI lesion accumulation. Now again, this kind of ties back to what we were talking about in the microbiome. We know that high vitamin D levels are associated with an expansion of one particular short-chain fatty acid in the gut that is one of those signals that sends calming anti-inflammatory messages to the rest of the body. So taking vitamin D matters. Now, the evidence for disease-modifying therapy, DMT for short, disease-modifying therapy, therapies that treat multiple sclerosis. This is a slide I've borrowed from my colleague, Dr. Corboy, who you'll hear from later. We have very good data, very good evidence from these formalized studies that taking a disease-modifying therapy in relapsing and remitting MS has a positive effect on relapses, on disease progression. What you see here in the first column is relative reduction of relapse rate, and this is compared to placebo. So let me take an example here. The first one that we see, interferon beta 1b, 34% relative reduction in relapse rate compared to placebo. In other words, we know that it works. There is a decrease in relapse rate for patients who take these medicines. And you can see in the studies listed here, going all the way down, the various numbers correlating to how well that medicine in that study compared to no medicine at all. We know that these medicines work. So it matters. But why do we not take these medicines if we know that they all work? Well, that comes down to risk. And risk is something that is hard to qualify for each person. We know that different people perceive risks in different ways. The risks of getting struck by lightning in your lifetime, surprisingly high. 1 in 3,000. The risks of getting in a car accident per mile driven, 1 in 447,000. If you drove 10 miles to get here today, that would be 44,000, 1 in 44,000. Many of us drive much more than that, certainly in a week. The odds of dying in a plane crash, thankfully, quite rare. Now, these are risk tables that we have pertinent to just one of our disease-modifying therapies, which is natalizumab. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't risks associated with the other medicines. You'll hear from Dr. Gross about that later. But the risk here has been very well categorized because of an FDA mandate that we need to keep really close track of the patients on this medicine. So what we see is if you don't have the JC virus, your risk of this infection called PML is less than 1 in 1,000, significantly less than 1 in 1,000. And we have further characterization that the risk is dependent on the number of months, years that you've been on the medicine, and whether or not you are JC positive, you have been exposed to this virus called the JC virus, the John Cunningham virus, and whether or not you've had immunosuppressant use. We can very precisely quantify the risk of these medicines, specifically in natalizumab, by looking at the experiences of those that have gone before us. And we see that the risk changes with the amount of time that you've been on the medicine. So here, post-marketing, this is all comers risk. Here we see if you've had 1 to 12 infusions, your risk is quite low. It goes up if you've had 13 to 24, 25 to 36, and so forth. So we know that there are risks associated with the medicines, but knowing the risks helps us to manage them, and we know that the disease-modifying therapies work. So let's talk about a real-life experience. So CS was a man fearful of disease-modifying therapies. He took glatiramer acetate, Copaxone, but he took it irregularly because of the pain associated with the subcutaneous injections, the edema and swelling that came from the injections, and unfortunately suffered several exacerbations per year. During these exacerbations, he took steroids, he was out of work, he was unable to participate in family activities, and the family dynamic changed. The family was less confident planning things like vacations, road trips, not really certain whether or not that was going to be affected by a relapse and the need to take steroids during that time. His work became intolerant of absences, and he gradually, with each exacerbation, accumulated more symptoms. So grudgingly was subsequently convinced to take a higher efficacy medication. This cut back on the number of exacerbations he was taking, the number of times he needed to take steroids in the year, led to better attendance at family events, better attendance at work, and an overall better mood and ability to participate in his life. So a final word about cigarette smoking, and you have some of this data in your packet. We know that it negatively influences multiple sclerosis. We know that it negatively influences other things. It's associated with a risk of MS as well as a risk of worsening MS once you have it. And here I've included some of the mechanisms by which we think that occurs. Direct effect on demyelination, disruption of the blood-brain barrier, and so forth. So if I have hopefully convinced you that they're all important, how do you prioritize? Well, and this is where we get down to action. So in your packet, you have this table. And if you'll all turn to it now, I'd like you to just eyeball this table and make a commitment to going through this during a break. Looking at each of the different things that I've hopefully convinced you, make a difference. They matter to your health. Assessing where you are right now, assessing feasibility, whether or not making a change in that area is something you feel is feasible. Assessing the difficulty so that you go into it knowing, this is a hard thing, but I think it's still a good thing, and assessing the immediacy. This exercise will help you to know which area to focus on, because we do know that in a sea of shoulds, you do need a focus. So how? Believe that what you do matters, and I hope that some of the evidence that I've shared with you today has convinced you that what you do does matter. Get help. I like the saying that every superhero has a sidekick. Decide who your sidekick is going to be and then enlist them to help you. Learn from your own history what you've tried to do in the past and hasn't worked, what you've done in the past and has worked, and learn from others. And lastly, try to make it fun. Making it fun will help to get this change in motion. So here's my question to you. Are you willing to make a change? If so, I'd like you to write it down. There is also a spot on that same piece of paper for you to write down a change that you would like to make in one of the 5 areas that we've just discussed. And do it before tomorrow night. Not only that, tell somebody. You can send a message to your provider, you could send a message to me, you can tell your partner, but tell someone about a change that you would like to make to improve your health, because it does matter. And so I will leave you with this quotation from Eleanor Roosevelt and say, my wish for you is for a newer and richer experience. Thank you.
Wonderful presentation, Dr. Schreiner. Thank you so much. And it's such an important way. I hope you all found that a valuable way to begin thinking about prioritization and really knowing that what you do truly does matter, and those changes that you can make will make a positive difference in your life. I would now like to introduce Shannon Cornell, nurse practitioner here on campus, who will tell us more about what wellness means to the Rocky Mountain MS Center, and it's a concept you might start hearing more about in the coming months and years here at the MS Center. So thank you, Shannon. I would like to add just one thing. For folks viewing on live stream, I neglected to mention your evaluation form for this event will be on our website. So we definitely want to hear, we have so many people tuning in from afar. We would love your feedback as well. So go to mscenter.org and you'll find that evaluation sheet. Also, just a reminder to keep marking questions on your note cards, and volunteers will be around to collect those. Thanks again.
Okay, good morning. Can everyone hear me? I think I have to stand close to this one. I'm so excited to be with you this morning. Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Dr. Schreiner. So this is a perfect lead into the next topic, which I'll talk to you a little bit about, which is wellness. And I'd like to discuss what it means to us as individuals and as patients, and then get a little bit of a deeper meaning and understand it better, since it is such a very broad topic. First of all, wellness has multiple definitions, not just one size fits all. The World Health Organization actually defines it as a state of competent physical, mental, and social well-being, not only the absence of disease. The National Wellness Institute defines it as a conscious, self-directed, and evolving process of achieving your full potential. Wellness is always the whole well-being. It's holistic, and it's always positive and affirming. I'd like to just point out that the definition from the National Wellness Institute highlights the conscious and self-directed piece of it. This is actually an underpinning the theory of self-efficacy, which is extremely important on your path to wellness. Self-efficacy is the development of skills and beliefs in your capability to use those skills during your path to change, but not only that, how to maintain these behavior changes throughout the process. The National Wellness Institute came up with a multi-dimensional model right up here, and there's 6 dimensions that go into wellness and not just one. And starting from the top and going clockwise, you can see that's very interesting. When it comes to mind, we always think of the emotional piece and the spiritual piece, but they talk about occupational wellness, intellectual, and social. So I'd like to break them down for you one by one so we have a little bit of a better understanding, and then how do we apply that to our lives. So again, and I apologize, I might have to go back and forth, but starting from the top with occupational, this was actually developed by the co-founder of the National Wellness Institute, Dr. Bill Hetler. And the occupational piece of wellness recognizes a personal satisfaction and enrichment in one's life through work. Traveling down this path, you'll contribute your own unique gifts, talents, and skill sets that are both personally meaningful and rewarding. We need to try to choose a career which is consistent with our personal values and interests. The next dimension of the model is the physical piece, which Dr. Schreiner explained to us a little bit more in depth. But this piece of wellness recognizes the need for regular physical activity, but that physical development encourages learning about diet and nutrition, while again discouraging smoking, drug use, or excessive alcohol intake. Optimal wellness is met through a combination of good exercise and sound nutrition, and then listening to your body, how your body responds to that. We know, as Dr. Schreiner pointed out, it's better to consume foods that enhance health rather than impair it. The third aspect of wellness is the social piece of it. Social is encouraging to contribute our environment, in one's environment and community, and being active and a participant in it. We want to enhance our personal relationships and continue with important friendships to build a better living space, but a better support around us. We know that it's better to live in harmony with others and our environment rather to live in conflict with them. Moving down is the fourth piece, which is the intellectual aspect of wellness. This recognizes our creative and stimulating mental activities by exploring issues and problem-solving learning. We should spend more time pursuing personal interests in reading and then keeping up on current events and news. It's better to stretch our minds and challenge it than become self-satisfied and unproductive. The last two, number 5, is the spiritual piece. And this recognizes our search for meaning and purpose in our lives. While traveling through this path of wellness during the spiritual piece, you may experience many feelings of doubt, despair, fear, and disappointment, but as well as feelings of pleasure, joy, happiness, and discovery. All of these are important during our journey to help bring meaning to our lives and to encourage optimal wellness. We should strive to live each day in a way that's consistent with our own values and beliefs than to do otherwise and feel untrue to ourselves. The sixth piece, the emotional piece of the 6 dimensions, recognizes awareness and acceptance of our feelings. On this path, you'll be able to arrive at personal choices and decisions based on your feelings, thoughts, philosophies, and behaviors. It's better to be aware and accept our feelings than to deny them, and it's better to live optimistically than pessimistically. Now, how do we use this in our daily lives, and what does it mean to us as patients, families, friends? We know that people with MS encounter many stresses and unpredictable challenges living with a chronic neurologic disease whose cause and prognosis is unknown and often associated with unpredictable or potential degree of functional disability, and then possibly with a spectrum of symptoms. The outlook for MS has recently become much more promising with the advent of disease-modifying medications Dr. Schreiner just went through briefly. Still, people with MS need to seek out and reestablish and maintain control of their lives in order to sustain and improve quality of life. This is by practicing health-promoting behaviors and integrating these wellness dimensions into our lifestyles. We know very much so data suggests that these behaviors, most notably physical activity and stress management, have a positive effect on disease activity, functional status, mental health, mental and physical health, and overall quality of life day to day. So if we have a better understanding of what wellness is, what it means to us, and what makes it up, then we can help create our own pathway and journey to strive for optimal living. Here at the Rocky Mountain MS Center, we're actually working on designing a program pilot, which has been really exciting for us, which is going to be a small group to explore how to integrate these topics of wellness into our clinic setting, how to track their impact, and then how to prove that impact to payers so they'll be more willing to start to cover some of these services that we know are not covered right now. And then that'll lead to improved accessibility. The pilot wellness program will focus here at the university, at the Rocky Mountain MS Center, will focus on physical activity, nutrition, and emotional support. It'll initially serve 25 to 50 patients to test, track, measure, and measure outcomes with the goal of creating a model that will provide transformational change for thousands of our patients down the road. This pilot will serve to help our patients with conditions, disabling conditions, to help develop skills that have potential to influence on attitudes, health behaviors, and again, to promote overall quality of life. We wouldn't be able to do this if it wasn't for the Jimmy Huga Endowment Center, who has made a donation to the Rocky Mountain MS Center to help fund this pilot wellness program. For those of you who don't know, Jimmy Huga was an Olympic skier who, through his own emotional and physical fight with MS, pioneered a revolutionary philosophy of care for people living with MS. We have long promoted an overall wellness approach to living with MS at the Rocky Mountain MS Center, and this will only solidify our approach with a Huga spirit and the vision to improve quality of life and to integrate wellness into our daily lives. Thank you guys for letting me come and talk to you just briefly about wellness. And today, after me, I'm going to introduce Holly, who is our registered dietitian, certified nutrition support clinician, and certified wellness coach. She's currently also working on her associate's degree in culinary arts. Holly has experience in working with people on nutrition for a variety of issues, ranging from general healthy eating to support for critical and chronically ill patients. She works here at the University of Colorado in the integrative medicine, pulmonary, and cardiac rehabilitation clinics. Thank you.
Just use this forward back.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today. As Shannon said, I work now at the University of Colorado Health Center for Integrative Medicine, and they have, the basic idea there is to combine conventional medicine with complementary and alternative medicine, and in addition to nutrition counseling, they also offer a number of other modalities that can be potentially beneficial, including acupuncture, chiropractic. They do urban supplement consults with a pharmacist, massage therapy, mind and body therapy, nutrition counseling, physical therapy, traditional Chinese medicine, and yoga. So now I want to get into a little bit about nutrition. So the main thing that I want to point out is that there is not necessarily a specific diet that controls MS. There are a number that have been promoted, but none has really been proven to be effective in treating MS. So a few of those that have been promoted are the Swank diet, and this is a very stringent, low-fat diet. Dr. Swank did the initial study on that, and he found good results, but there were a number of study flaws. There was no control group, a group that had no intervention done. And in addition to that, there was nobody since then has been able to duplicate his findings. So there's generally no accepted proof that the Swank diet is effective in controlling MS. There's the paleo diet, and this one is promoted by Dr. Terry Walls. It's a diet that's basically focused on non-domesticated meats and then plant-based foods except for grains. And this diet has also been, in one small study, found to be beneficial, but it was lumped with a bunch of other interventions aside from diet, so we can't really tease out at this point what benefits came from the diet versus what came from the other interventions. Another one is the McDougall diet, and this one is a very high carbohydrate, low fat diet. There was one small study that showed improvements in fatigue, but not in MS disease activity. And the downside to this diet is that there can be risks for various nutrition deficiencies. Another diet, and I didn't have it up there, that I know has been promoted is the gluten-free diet. And while this one's definitely beneficial in celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, it's not been found to be beneficial at this point in MS. So the bottom line is that while there have been a number of diets that have been suggested for MS, none has been shown to be superior to others, and there's no concrete evidence that a specific diet does control MS. So you're probably wondering why I'm here talking to you then, if that's the case. The idea is that good nutrition is still beneficial. It can still have beneficial impacts in some MS symptoms, and it also lowers the risk of other diseases and disorders. So it's still a really important piece. So until there's solid evidence showing that a specific diet is better for MS, following a healthy diet in accordance with either the U.S. dietary guidelines, a Mediterranean diet, or the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, or the DASH diet, is one of those that we recommend. At this point, what we do know is what's good for your heart is good for your brain, and those three diets are good for both. So although the Mediterranean diet itself has not been studied in MS, it has been shown to reduce inflammatory markers in other autoimmune diseases. In addition to this, vascular risk disease factors, so obesity, hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, are common in people with MS, and these risk factors have been shown to have negative effects on disease and disability progression. So the Mediterranean diet has anti-inflammatory effects and reduces vascular disease, making it possibly beneficial for multiple sclerosis. And it's been consistently demonstrated to provide a degree of protection against a number of chronic diseases, including mortality, cardiovascular disease, cancer, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and other cognitive decline, and depression. So what exactly is a Mediterranean diet? Does it just mean that you're going to add feta to every meal? That is not the case. So the answer is that there's not really a single definition of the Mediterranean diet. It's kind of a general guideline. So it's characterized by a high intake of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, olive oil, and a moderate intake of fish, a low to moderate intake of poultry and dairy products, generally in the form of cheese and yogurt, a low intake of red meat, and a regular, everybody's favorite, the regular but moderate intake of alcohol. So I did combine a number of various studies, various recommendations for Mediterranean diet so that I can give you guys some approximate guidelines to follow. So first one is vegetables. So eating 4 or more servings of vegetables each day is recommended. And a serving of vegetables is going to be about 1 cup of raw vegetables or about half cup of cooked vegetables. I do recommend trying to get a variety of colors in there because the different colors have different nutrients, different antioxidants, so it is important to kind of get a variety. And then I do recommend eating more vegetables than fruits. I know a lot of times those go hand in hand, like eat your fruits and veggies, but they're both important, so it's not half plate of just fruit, it's fruits and vegetables. Vegetables have a lower glycemic index, which means that they spike your blood sugar less, so they're a little bit less inflammatory. So fruit is also an important component of the Mediterranean diet, and I recommend getting 3 servings of fruit each day. A serving of fruit is about the size of a baseball or a tennis ball. And one really good way to get fruit into your diet is to substitute this in for dessert. So instead of having a cookie or a piece of cake or something like that, have a piece of fruit. It's still sweet, but it's going to be healthy and it's part of the Mediterranean diet. Whole grains are another important part of the Mediterranean diet, and these ones you want to get 4 or more servings each day. Whole grains are going to be, so a serving, is about the size of a piece of bread or like a half cup of cooked oats. And I do want to emphasize the whole part of the whole grains. Refined grains have been processed, they've been stripped of their fiber and a lot of their nutrients, so it's not the same to eat refined grains than whole grains. So trying to look for ways in your diet that you might be able to substitute instead of white bread, whole grain bread, instead of white rice, brown rice, things like that. Legumes are an important part of the Mediterranean diet, and with these you'd want to consume 3 or more servings each week, and serving size for this really isn't that big. It's about a half cup of cooked beans or legumes. Nuts and seeds are also another important part of a Mediterranean diet, so 3 or more servings of these each week. And this is one where I do get a lot of questions because nuts and seeds are high in calories, they're high in fat, so people think, oh, you got to avoid them. But these can actually be a really healthy part of your diet. They do have fat, but it's a healthy type of fat, and they also have fiber and other vitamins and minerals. Serving sizes where you do have to watch this, though, so not more than a handful a day, and that serving size for the 3 or more servings each week is 3, so each serving is 1 ounce, so 3 ounces a week, and an ounce is about the size of a golf ball, so it doesn't take a lot to meet that goal. And I didn't touch on this, but one way that I always recommend getting more nuts into your diet is to have those instead of a processed snack food. So if you're on the go, on the run, take a banana and a small bag of nuts or something like that, rather than getting like a packaged peanut butter and jelly cracker type thing. Just to touch on real quick, the foods that we just talked about, the fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, are all high fiber, which is definitely an important part of a healthy diet. The other side of that, though, is if you don't increase your water intake, you will get constipated. So it's important to drink plenty of water as well. So a little bit on fats. Fats are an important part of the Mediterranean diet, and there are different types of fats, so it's not an across-the-board thing. We used to recommend at one point a low-fat diet for health, but it's been shown that a plant-based diet with healthy fats is actually better for you than a low-fat diet. So to get into kind of the different types of fats, the one you want to avoid altogether is those trans fats, and those are the ones that are basically people took liquid fat, so oils, things like that, turned it into a solid fat. It makes it more shelf stable and it makes it terrible for you. So trying to avoid those. Those are going to be found in a lot of packaged foods, packaged snack foods, fried foods, kind of that junk food category, baked goods, pastries. So trying to avoid those junk foods, but also they can kind of sneak in on some food labels. If they make the serving size small enough, they can say 0 grams trans fats, even when there are some present. So what I always recommend is looking at the nutrition ingredients, and if you see the words hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, you know that that food probably contains some trans fats. Next type of unhealthy fat is your saturated fats, and these ones you're going to get some in your diet. It's not about avoiding it altogether, but it's about not getting too much of those in your diet. Saturated fats are going to be found in like poultry skin. They're going to be found in red meats, especially the kind that has a lot of marbling, a lot of those white flecks throughout the meat. They're also going to be found in high-fat dairy products like cream, whole milk, butter, and they're also going to be found in some of your tropical plant oils like palm oil, coconut oil. So trying to minimize those in your diet. The other part of this is the healthy fats. So some of the fats are good for us. So there's the monounsaturated fats, and that's the one that's pretty prevalent in the Mediterranean diet because that's the main fat in olive oil. It's also found in canola oil, it's found in peanut oil, it's found in nuts, avocados, and avocado oil. So that's a type of fat that's healthy and that's okay to include in your diet. The omega-3 polyunsaturated fats are also part of a healthy diet, and we'll talk about fish next. So they're found in fish. They're also found in chia seeds, flax seeds, and walnuts are some other good sources. And these ones are beneficial. They can help to improve mood and memory and can also improve the health of your blood vessels and lower triglycerides. And then the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats are another healthy one, and they can be found in corn, sunflower, and safflower oils. So fish and shellfish. Goal for that is to eat about 2 to 3 servings per week, and a serving is about the size of a deck of cards, or if it's a nice flat piece of fish, it'd be about the size of a checkbook. So these give you the omega-3, so that's why they are so healthy, and making sure to choose the more fatty fish is important, so things like salmon, albacore, tuna, herring, sardines, those are some good choices. And everybody's favorite, moderate alcohol consumption is part of the Mediterranean diet. If it's okay with your doctor, I do always want to specify that because not all medications mix with alcohol, so you want to be cautious about that. But if your doctor is okay with it, 1 serving of alcohol, usually red wine, about 5 ounces for women, or 1 to 2 servings of alcohol, or about 5 to 10 ounces per men is okay. If you don't drink now, you don't have to start drinking, but this is part of the Mediterranean diet. The other piece of that I always like to point out is that you don't get to save up all 7 days of drinks and have it on Saturday night. There is no benefit to that one. I know, nobody likes to hear that. So foods to limit on the Mediterranean diet, red meat and processed meat. So biggest thing you can do here a lot of times is just watching your portion size. If you go to a steakhouse, your steak might be this big. So keeping it more to that deck of cards size is going to really help cut down on that. And then trying to stay away from processed meat, so hot dogs, bacon, sausage. They've got nitrates and nitrites and all sorts of junk in there that's not good for us. Added sugar, so we also want to avoid this on the Mediterranean diet. So I think I already said fruit instead of sugary foods for dessert, trying to choose water also instead of sugary beverages is going to be helpful. And then salt, and I think Dr. Schreiner already talked quite a bit about decreasing salt. So the Mediterranean diet really encourages use of herbs and spices instead of salt to flavor foods. And then lastly, dairy, and this is one that I do like to point out, varies between the Mediterranean diet and the US 2015 dietary guidelines and the MyPlate system, where they still encourage the 3 cups of milk. Mediterranean diet usually limits to less than 1 cup of milk a day. So the thing there is I would recommend chatting with your doctor about that because I don't want to set you up for calcium and vitamin D deficiency if we're cutting down on milk. So supplements, and I think we've already kind of touched on vitamin D, but basically there's not compelling evidence to recommend supplementation of any particular vitamins and minerals for people with MS. That being said, if your vitamin D level is low, so keeping that vitamin D level in a good range by supplementing is definitely appropriate and recommended. Antioxidants are one that I want you to be particularly cautious about supplementing because antioxidants can increase the immune system or can stimulate the immune system. And in MS, where immune system is part of the disease, that can potentially be not beneficial at all. And then lastly, I always like to touch, because I think people think supplements are regulated the same way as medications, so I always like to let people know that they are not. With medications, they have to have amounts of proven safety before they go to market. With supplements, they have to be proven unsafe to get pulled from the market. So I always want people to be really cautious about any supplement choices you are making and talk to your doctor and pharmacist about it, because some supplements can interact with medications. So a little bit on navigating the grocery store, just because we've talked about kind of how to eat healthy, but how do you actually kind of apply that to your daily, weekly life? So what I want to do is just kind of go down the list of these areas and tell you what I look for, what I watch for in each of these aisles. I've been told and kind of had that recommendation before of shop the perimeter, and in general, that's a really good idea. That's where your produce is, that's where your veggies, your fruits, all of that are. It's also where the bakery is, though, so not necessarily an across-the-board recommendation. So with canned goods, I always recommend looking for the salt content of those. Some canned goods are loaded with salt, but there's more options now that they're putting out there that are low salt, no added salt options. Chips and crackers aisle, what I'd look for there is the salt content and what kind of fat was used in there. Looking especially in this area for that partially hydrogenated type foods in that nutrition facts label as your red flag for this contains trans fat. With the health food aisle, I want you to actually read the ingredients label if you're looking for a health food bar or a snack bar. A lot of them can really end up being just kind of candy bars in disguise. So seeing, okay, is this based on nuts and fruits, or is it glucose syrup mixed with who knows what else? Beverage aisle, again, main recommendation is get water in. That's going to be your best beverage. If you're choosing things like soda, juice, a lot of times there's added sugars in those kind of products, so be really cautious about that. Pasta, rice, and beans aisle. You can find some really good choices here that are both healthy and economical. So things like whole grain pasta, dried beans, whole grain brown rice are some good choices. Of course, you do have to avoid the white rice and the, especially like the rice-a-roni, pasta-roni type meals where there's that big packet of flavoring that's got lots of added salt, so being really cautious about those choices. The coffee, cereal, tea aisle. With cereal, I always recommend choosing whole grain options. My favorite is steel-cut oats, but just making sure you're not getting something with a lot of added sugar to it. And then coffee and tea by themselves are perfectly healthy, but not so much depending on what you might be ordering at Starbucks or something like that. Usually the added creamers, sweeteners, sugars, all of that can kind of add up and make it a not so healthy food, so be cautious about those. Baking aisle is a really good place to look for herbs, seasonings, spices that don't contain added salt as ways to flavor your food. Of course, you can also find the white flour, lots of sugar, all that stuff on that aisle, so being cautious to avoid that. With the produce aisle, this is where about half of your plate should come from, is fruits and veggies and that kind of choices. Trying to choose, again, that variety of colors. I do have an uncle who likes to tell me, oh yeah, his food is really, really colorful because he likes to eat a lot of jelly beans, but that is not the same. So really making those good, healthy fruit and vegetable colorful choices. The bakery aisle, we talked about this a little bit, choosing whole grain choices, steering clear of the cakes, the pastries, all of that. With the deli and meats section, we kind of talked a little bit already about like deli meats, fish, all that. But with the deli, those end up being more processed meats, and so watching out for the sodium content of those. A lot of times deli meats will last for a while in the fridge, and that's because they're loaded with a salt preservative. And then with dairy, the things I like to point out for that aisle is looking for lower fat choices or non-fat choices. And then also be aware some dairy products end up really being more like sweetened desserts. So looking out for the sweetened yogurts, looking out for the chocolate milk, not making those choices. And then the frozen food aisle, and this is one where I think you can kind of have this as a convenience food. So frozen fruit, frozen veggies without added sauces are a great thing to have around to add into meals. And then watching out, though, for the other foods in that one, the Hungry Man type dinners that are loaded with salt and fat, not the best choice. So I wanted to touch just real briefly on fighting fatigue, and I'm going to run through this quick because I think I'm running out of time. But it's all, I've talked to you a lot about, hey, choose this, eat healthy by doing this. But if you're feeling too exhausted to really put these into play, that can make it pretty tough. So a few tips to help fight fatigue include eating small, regular meals, not going more than 4 hours without eating. That tends to set you up to get really hungry and then make bad choices. Plan your meals in advance whenever you can. Stock up on healthy snack items and healthy pantry and freezer items. If you've got low sodium canned beans at home, if you've got canned tuna, if you've got frozen veggies, if you've got the pre-washed, pre-cut vegetables in a bag, you can make some better choices if you do go home and you need something to eat right away than if you're running past McDonald's on the way home. Sometimes having a tall stool or chair in the kitchen can be helpful so you can sit down to do your meal prep. Making bigger batches of food can also be helpful, so you can freeze some later to have when you're having a lower energy day. And then also being prepared for what you need. We're all gonna choose takeout food or frozen food sometimes, so know some healthier options in your neighborhood. Have some healthier frozen dinners ready to go in your freezer. And then lastly, there are some grocery store delivery options or pickup options as well. So if you need to take something off your plate, that can be a helpful way to do that, where they deliver the groceries that you order to your house. So I know Walmart, King Soopers, Safeway, Albertsons, all have that as an option. So now that I've talked your ear off for a little while, I do want you to these questions are in your book, so I do want you to think about these questions. So first thing that I want you to do is think about how the Mediterranean diet is different from the way that you currently eat. So just give it a moment. Okay. So now I want you to think of one goal, and this can be kind of a general goal that you want to work towards. So maybe you saw that the Mediterranean diet was a lot higher in veggies than what you're typically eating. So maybe your goal is, I want to eat more veggies. So think about what that goal looks like for you. Okay. So lastly, I want you to either write down or tell your neighbor what is one step that you will take this week towards that goal. So if you said, I need to eat more veggies, maybe that means stocking up on frozen veggies at the store and adding a half cup of cooked veggies to every dinner. Maybe that's getting a baggie of carrots to take to lunch every day. What is that going to look like for you? Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to come speak with you today.
Tell me when you're ready.
I'm going to be right here. So
Okay.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Holly. That was some really great information about nutrition. Very thorough and real-life application there. So our next segment is going to actually showcase individuals, patients that have MS, who discovered how to put wellness into action through very different programs. And they're going to give you their own accounts through a couple of videos. This focuses on the aspect of wellness that many people have indicated an interest in, which is staying active. Here at the Rocky Mountain MS Center, we believe it's important to stay active, and we know that looks different for every person. There are a lot of ways and plenty of support to help you get more movement into your life. And as you watch the videos, you'll see that these activities go beyond just exercising our bodies. They're creating communities and contributing to emotional well-being. Our first video is an interview with Peggy, who participates in the Rocky Mountain MS Center Hydrotherapy program. This is a very unique water exercise program which offers individuals of all abilities a variety of exercise opportunities, including adapted swimming, deep and shallow water aerobic exercise, balance and flexibility, and training options. The water's resistance results in more controlled movements, and participants experience an independence that's otherwise denied to them in other environments.
I was diagnosed with MS in '92. I have a lot of problems with balance. That's one of my major symptoms, I'd say. We get in the water about chest high, and we stand and do a lot of work balancing and strength building while you're doing that. You can now stand on one leg, or you can stand without holding on to anything because the water is holding you up, and you're able to, if you fall back or something, you're able to catch yourself. And it's just a whole different feeling. The work I've done in the water, the exercises I've done, have actually helped me stay walking as well as I've continued to walk. And it gives you a reason to get out. And sometimes, just being stuck in a place, home or wherever, is debilitating in itself. You're out there with other people. doing this or that, I don't know what I'd be doing otherwise. It's been a lifesaver for me. It just has allowed me to move in ways that you cannot move, obviously, in gravity and all of that. So, different parts of my body that I'm not able to move outside of the pool, I'm able to kick, I'm able to stand up and walk, or you can do almost anything, it feels like.
Sorry about that, some technical difficulties. Our second video features Patrick, who enjoys a variety of activities with the Breckenridge Outdoor Education Center. In collaboration with the Rocky Mountain MS Center, this program provides custom-designed retreats for people living with MS and their friends and family members. The program offers 2 adult courses per year based out of the lodge in Breckenridge. In the winter, participants can enjoy alpine skiing, Nordic skiing, and snowboarding. In the summer, participants take part in a different activity each day, including high ropes course, rock climbing, rafting and paddling, and adaptive cycling. Each day, there are also home-cooked meals and an opportunity for the participants to come together, share their stories, and celebrate their adventures from that day.
I've been lucky to be born and raised in Colorado, and the first ski lesson I had, I think I was about 8 years old. I was diagnosed with MS in November of 2001. It did cross my mind that skiing would be difficult because most of my issues were with balance, and then I have more weakness on the right side of my body. The last time I had skied, I guess you would say normally, was that ski season of 2001, which was just previous to my diagnosis. Kind of in the back of my mind, I was thinking, there's got to be a way that I can ski again. Thankfully, my wife was reading one of the newsletters from the Rocky Mountain MS Center that featured an article about the Breckenridge Outdoor Education Center's ski program, and she told me about it, and I said, oh my gosh, that sounds like it'd be amazing. The thoughts that started going through my head were, oh my gosh, I'm on the mountain again, and all the senses, I guess, that you have, the cold air, the snow, the smell of the pine trees, it kind of just carried me back in time, and I just felt like, wow, this is, I'm so happy I'm here. The volunteers really help out a lot, especially making sure you're safe and that you're not on collision course with anybody. That's what's so great about that program is whatever works for you, they will, try to help you spend the most time on what's working for you, but if you get tired or that stops working, they can, suggest another method. Finding a program like the BOEC, that I would say really opened my eyes to, I'm still in Colorado, there are still all these things that I just love to do, and here's this group of people that want to help me get back to those activities and be outside.
For our third and final video of this morning is with Elizabeth, who will reflect on what Colorado lifestyle means to her after her diagnosis with MS.
I was diagnosed in 2013 when the doctor said those two words, multiple sclerosis. I just wanted to collapse. I came to Colorado for biking and running and hiking and all the outdoor things that people come here for, and I was living a Colorado lifestyle up until I heard those two words. And so I had a couple months of just not being able to keep up with my friends and hiking, losing my job. My whole life was 180 different than what I thought it was going to be at that point. MS for MS is a fundraiser through the Rocky Mountain MS Center. The goal is to climb a mountain, and the mountain is not necessarily literal. It's as figurative as it is literal, where you can climb a 14er, you can walk 14,000 steps, and that be your 14er. I've truly learned to accept who I am today. Hiking with MS is a very different experience than before hiking with MS. And it's true, the summit looks the same, the view looks the same, but the experience is not the same. I feel so much more pride when I go up because I feel like I'm still doing this and my leg is maybe numb and I may want to sit down, but I am able to do this despite the MS. Whereas before it was still a struggle to get to the top. Climbing mountains is not easy, but I would be focused on time. If I didn't get up quick enough, it was disappointing. Now if it takes me all day to get up and all day to get down, that's fine. I actually really enjoy the experience of my surroundings. The past 2 years with the MS for MS, I have beat Dr. Corboy up to the top of the summit.
Wonderful. I really enjoyed hearing those stories about people who are putting wellness into action in a variety of ways, and I hope you enjoyed hearing from them as much as I did. I want to point out that the last video you heard from Elizabeth, who participated in MS for MS, and MS for MS is a do-it-your-own-way approach to raising awareness and support for the Rocky Mountain MS Center. You can hike a trail, you can walk laps in your own neighborhood, or you can set out with a team to hike a peak, a 14er. We actually have a fun kickoff event coming up on June 2nd at our King Adult Day Enrichment program, where participants can pick up their shirts and complete a flat 14er around our building. So happy if you are interested in participating in that. There's an early bird discount for registering in May. And now I would like to invite up to the stage Sarah Kiger, Michelle Harrison, and Claire DeCola. Please join me. The programs that you heard about in the stories, in the videos, were featured here, and these are the leaders of those programs. So Michelle Harrison, a physical therapist, has worked to lead our hydrotherapy program for many, many years. It's a wonderful resource. If you're interested, please do find Michelle at the break. She would be happy to talk with you more about it. Claire DeCola is admissions director for BOEC, the Breckenridge Outdoor Education Center. We're so proud to partner with BOEC, and it was great to have Patrick with us here today as well. Thank you. And I should mention Peggy, who you saw in the hydrotherapy video, is also here. Shout out to Peggy and Patrick. And then Sarah Kiger is our event and volunteer manager at the Rocky Mountain MS Center. And Sarah is leading our efforts to coordinate our MS for MS events this summer. So please talk with Sarah at the break or after the event. She can get you all signed up if you're interested or just want to learn more about it. So thank you all for being here. Really appreciate all your great work. Round of applause. So now we are going to break, so please make your way into the hallway foyer area and help yourself to more refreshments and drinks. I will acknowledge, I apologize, we're running a bit behind schedule, so we will try to move things forward along quickly to be respectful of your time, but know we're about 15 minutes behind schedule right now, so I really appreciate your patience, and we'll give a call out when we want folks to come back into the room. So thank you so much. To introduce Dr. Tim Vollmer, who will be presenting on the topic of the evolution of our understanding of MS and its treatment. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Tim Vollmer to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me out there? A little low? There's a way to turn it up a bit. So I'd like to add my welcome to you, all of you here, as well as those who are online. We've had some excellent, I think, discussions this morning, and these are all based on a concept that we've been developing for the last 7, 8 years. And this is concept of maximizing lifelong brain health in MS. And this is a concept that I've discussed around the world. And I would say that my colleagues in Europe, in our collaboration there on this topic, have probably done more to move it into the mainstream than we've done here in the United States. And the discussions you had this morning on wellness and nutrition are not just feel-good things. They have a very strong scientific basis if you look at them from the perspective of maximizing lifelong brain health. So brain health, when we use this term, what we mean is that brain is going to be important for you for several different reasons, not just for MS. Maximizing your brain health now will pay dividends as we age, because we all need extra brain function to mask the normal changes that we see in the brain over time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some other aspects of this. The first one is that our understanding of the immunology of MS has undergone a fundamental change in the last couple of years, something that most of my colleagues have not yet stumbled to. The second thing is that we are at a tipping point when it comes to the treatment of MS with anti-inflammatory therapies. We have now reached a point where we can begin to shift our focus to actually repairing the nervous system and helping patients recover function. And then finally, I want to just talk about the next generation of clinical trials that we see coming, which are going to be different than the ones we've seen in the past. So these are all the conflicts of interest that I have. It's just important for you to understand that I do work with a lot of companies like all of us do. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask. We do a lot of consulting as well as research with them. So these are the goals to discuss how our understanding of the immunology has changed, to review the goals of treating MS, and to discuss what we think the future of MS therapy is. So the most important message I'd like to have you take away from this in terms of the biological basis of MS is that there was a discovery that occurred in mid-2015 in 2 different laboratories, one in the United States and one in Europe. And what they reported was something that violated the long-held beliefs, the religion about MS. And that is that the brain is an immunoprivileged site. It's different than almost all the other organs in the body in that it was not connected to the immune system through tubes that are called lymphatics. So these lymphatics are like your blood vessels. You have arteries, you have veins, and you have lymphatics. The difference is the lymphatics are draining off the fluid from your tissue, and it moves it back into the circulatory system. And it does that by moving it through the immune system so that the immune system can examine that fluid for any evidence of infection or cancer or other things going on. This is a very, very important system for health. But for a long time, since the 1930s, we've been taught that the brain was an immunoprivileged site because it didn't have lymphatics. We were wrong. So this is a summary of the slides. This happens to be a mouse brain, but it's the same for human brains. And that is that they identified these lymphatics were running on the inside of the big veins in the brain. And they drain out to the base of the skull, and they connect with lymph nodes in the deep part of the neck. These are called deep cervical lymph nodes. Prior to this, it was believed that the immune connection with the brain was primarily through tissue or fluid draining out through the nose and then draining into the superficial lymph nodes that you feel under your jaw and behind your ear when you get a cold. But it turns out that's actually not correct. There actually are draining out to these deep cervical lymph nodes. I'm going to explain why that is so important here in a second. But now we have a direct connection between the brain and the immune system, and it turns out that these deep cervical lymph nodes are where the cells that drive MS are coming from. So I'd like to introduce you to a cell that is the key cell from an immunological perspective in MS. It's the one that all of our therapies currently are trying to target to improve outcomes. And these are called B lymphocytes. So your immune system has 2 parts. One that's sort of an automatic system that recognizes certain molecules that we know are foreign, that we've evolved against for millions of years, and it responds to them as an infection or as cancer and tries to kill them or remove them. That's called the innate immune system. In other words, it's already been taught what it's going to learn. It doesn't learn anything more. It's done where it is. The next part of the immune system is called the adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system is like your brain. It changes from experience. So as you are vaccinated against various vaccines, as you're exposed to various viruses, bacteria, fungi, your immune system experiences those, and it develops new cells that have special receptors that can identify some molecule from those infection agents and then recognize them when they come back into your life and eliminate them before they cause a serious problem. So the immune system is constantly learning. In multiple sclerosis, unfortunately, it learns something it shouldn't do. It learns how to cause inflammation in the brain. That's an autoimmune disease. And the B cell is the key driver of it. So the two key parts of the adaptive immune system, the part that learns, are T cells and B cells. And T cells are generally thought of as the generals for the immune system, that they coordinate any attack and they direct it. Turns out that's not quite so true. And the B cells were thought to be more of an effector cell, that the B cells were primarily there to produce antibody. So when you get vaccinated to the flu virus, your body then produces antibodies, helps you neutralize that virus if you run into it. But it turns out that B cells are much more important to regulating the immune system than we thought. And in fact, in MS, it appears they are the key regulatory cell that allows the inflammation to occur in the brain. So B cells come from the bone marrow. So they come from stem cells, which produce a lot of other cell types in your body, but these stem cells can produce what are called pro-B cells, and then pre-B cells, and these cells are not quite B cells yet, but they're getting the characteristics. These pre-B cells then move to lymph nodes, and these are the lumps that you feel under your skin, under your arms, or other places if you have infections. And in the lymph nodes, they turn into mature, naive B cells. In other words, they're not taught. These are uneducated B cells. These B cells in the lymph node move into special structures that are called lymphoid follicles. And there, they interact with two other key cell types, the T cell that we've mentioned, and also a cell called the dendritic cell. The dendritic cell is a helper cell. It can engulf different infectious agents or molecules in your body and then present them in a way that the T cells and the B cells can see them. In other words, the dendritic cell basically has a hand that can grab the molecule of interest and hold it on its surface so these T cells and B cells can see it, interact with it, and then the two of them collaborate to lead to an expansion of the B cells so there's more of them. Then those B cells leave the lymph nodes, move back into the blood, and migrate to different parts of the body. And there are two forms of them. One is called the plasmablast, which turns into the plasma cell. And these are the cells that are the professional antibody makers. So when you get vaccinated against something, you produce these plasmablasts and plasma cells. They go back into the bone marrow, and they keep producing these antibodies probably for the rest of your life in many cases. So these are the cells that really produce the antibodies for all sorts of things. But the memory B cell is one that's capable of turning into these in the future, but it can also cause other activities. And so the memory B cells in MS turn out to enter the brain. And there, they are activated by something. We don't know what that something is. But they proliferate more, and they do get some T cell help. So they proliferate, so we have more of these B cells, and these B cells appear to then recirculate back out to the lymph node. Now, I showed you that the brain was connected to those deep cervical lymph nodes. And so what's happening is that these B cells, when they get into the brain, they then migrate in those lymphatics back to that deep cervical lymph node. So that deep cervical lymph node is a very special place for MS, because that's the place that's connected to the brain. And those B cells, when they get back in the lymph node, they continue to proliferate, and they continue to change their structure slightly to make them more efficient at attacking whatever they want to attack. In this case, it's something from the brain. Now, we've never been able to identify exactly what the target is in the brain in MS that produces these immune cells that then circulate back into the brain and cause the inflammation. And that may be because there's not a simple molecule or single molecule. Maybe that's a number of different factors in the brain can cause this, and that is the genetic factors that we inherit that determine how likely it is to develop these autoaggressive cells that can cause MS. And that genetic factor may work primarily in the brain, which would explain why in MS, unlike other autoimmune diseases, the only disease MS patients get is MS. They don't get other autoimmune diseases at increased rate. So you don't have an increased risk of other autoimmune diseases if you have MS. That's not true if you have lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or other inflammatory diseases. So it really suggests that there's something very special happening in the brain that does not shut off the production of these autoaggressive B cells and instead allows them to move back into the lymph node, proliferate, make more of them, and move back into the brain through the circulatory system and cause the inflammation again. B cells can do many different things. So we know that they make antibodies, and generally most people think that that's the primary function of them, but actually their primary function is helping educate the T cells. So those of you who have followed the immunology of MS for many years will recognize that the T cell has always been thought of as the key driver of MS. That is, it's the problem. Well, that's true in the animal model, but it doesn't appear to be true in humans. And the evidence for that is all the clinical trials that we've done. I've been involved in more than 40 different clinical trials of agents. Most of them failed. And the ones that failed uniformly were all the ones who were specifically targeting the T cell. So in human disease, despite the fact we had good therapies where we could target T cells selectively, it didn't have any benefit. It didn't decrease the amount of inflammation, didn't decrease relapse rates, and didn't have any impact on disability. Another thing that the B cells do is when they move into the brain, they proliferate and they cause these things we call ectopic lymphoid follicle-like aggregates, which just means that B cells are proliferating like they would in a lymph node, but they're doing it in the brain. And it was thought that these cells are driving the problem in MS. But again, our clinical trials suggest that that's not the case, because we can shut the disease off at a very, very high level without actually affecting these cells inside the blood-brain barrier. So when we block the B cells that are coming from those lymph nodes, we have a very high level of treatment effect, but they do not change what's happening to these B cells inside the blood-brain barrier, at least not for several years, at least 3 or 4 years. So that tells us that it is this B cell right here that's really causing the problem. And that leads us to the third function that they have, and that is that they produce hormone-like substances that interact with all the cells around them. And one cell they interact with is a cell in the brain called an astrocyte. An astrocyte is the brain cell that actually provides the structure for the brain, and it's the one that maintains the microenvironment in there, so it's in favor of neurons and oligodendrocytes, the myelin-forming cells. So the brain is a very, very tightly regulated organ, and it's the astrocytes that maintain that regulation. But they also happen to be part of the immune system. They're like that dendritic cell that I mentioned. They can also grab a protein or a molecule, put it on a surface and hold it for the T cells and B cells to interact with and respond to. And so they are part of what we call the innate immune system, and they make up about 40 to 50%, possibly 60% of the total brain volume. So the brain is actually a very rich immune organ. It has lots of immune cells in it, mainly the astrocytes, and they interact with the adaptive immune system. And these cytokines, when they are produced, they cause these astrocytes to change into what we call type 2 astrocytes, or pro-inflammatory astrocytes. And as I'll show you in a second, that causes a situation that may explain why we lose the myelin-forming cells and kill neurons in MS. So before I get there, I just wanted to go back to the B cells. So this is a model of what we currently understand about how these B cells are formed. So there's a parent B cell. It's this B cell A up here. And it's the cell that begins to react to something coming from the brain, begins to proliferate and produce more copies of itself. When the immune system makes more copies of cells, it changes the binding area in the receptor slightly to see whether they might be more effective at binding to whatever the target is and more effective at killing it. And so this A progeny cell is producing offspring, and these offspring are all a little bit different from the parent, but they share characteristics. And so you can identify by doing deep sequencing on the B cell receptors, you can identify the B cells are actually part of this family and derived from this single B cell up here. Now these B cells are in the deep cervical lymph node. They then leave the deep cervical lymph node and they move back into the circulation, into the blood, and they migrate into the brain. And in the brain, they also proliferate a bit, but most of the proliferation is in that deep cervical lymph node. And so there's this constant interchange between the B cells in the brain and the B cells in these deep cervical lymph nodes that's actually driving the disease. And we did not know this, and we would not have known it from the animal models because the animal models don't work this way. We have learned this simply because of the therapies that we've developed in MS over the last 25 years, and now that we're beginning to understand how they work, they're converging in one direction, and I'll come to that in a second. So these are the cells that if we can target effectively, particularly at the level of the deep cervical lymph node, we can maybe have even better effects in the future. In fact, if you're going to change the regulation of the immune cells involved in MS, you want to target that deep cervical lymph node because that's where the action is. So this is a cartoon that I've been working on for years and years, trying to clarify what I'm arguing about. And again, most of my colleagues don't agree with me, so you have to take that with a grain of salt. So this is the blood-brain barrier. So this is a blood vessel coming up, and there's the wall of the blood vessel that has cells that line it, and then there's a barrier behind it, and the immune cells have to migrate through that to get into the brain. So both B and T cells migrate across that routinely as part of their immune surveillance. In MS, though, the immune cells that are migrating across are ones that can react to the brain environment and cause damage. And again, these are coming from that deep cervical lymph node. The B cell, when it gets inside, it recognizes something in there that turns it on. And again, we don't know what that something is, but it activates the B cell. The B cell then recruits T cell help, but it turns out that the B cell can actually take a immature T cell and make it a mature T cell on its own, which would explain why our T cell-based therapies didn't work, because we took out the memory T cells, but they're not really necessary for this process. The B cell can make new ones. And so this T cell and B cell, they interact and they promote each other. It's like a vicious cycle. They both provide factors that allow the other one to grow and proliferate. And they produce what are called cytokines, which are hormone-like substances, and they lead to a resting astrocyte turning into an active astrocyte. And the active astrocyte is actually producing a number of molecules that are not toxic to the myelin-forming cells and to the neurons. And these are molecules like nitric oxide, oxygen-free radicals, tumor necrosis factor. These nitric oxide and oxygen-free radicals are produced by an enzyme called INOS, inducible nitric oxide synthase. And TNF and these oxygen-free radicals kill the energy-producing structures inside the myelin-forming cells and inside the neurons and axons. And neurons and axons, from the biological standpoint, are cells that have huge membranes. And so any decrease in energy for them means they can't maintain that membrane, and they die as a result. And that would explain why we have sort of what I would call a field effect in MS. So this model is not just made up, it actually fits with other clinical trials that we've done. So although the bulk of our most effective therapies are targeting the B cell and preventing it from getting into the brain, we have other therapies that are actually targeting these activated astrocytes that begins to block their ability to be active and then helps protect the myelin-forming cells and the neurons by decreasing production of nitric oxide, oxygen-free radicals, and TNF. So this model is very important for us because it provides the basis for the next evolution of therapies. And they're telling me I'm almost done, but this is looking at all studies that are, or the drugs that are approved, they all have B cell effects. So there's a convergence of data saying the B cell is the key target here. Just make a point here, Dr. Schreiner talked about this morning, is that we are at a tipping point with immunological therapies. So we have quite a few, almost 15 now, and we have this first generation, first-line drugs, and by that I mean they're approved by the FDA for first-line use. We have the second generation first-line drugs, again approved for first-line use. And then we have the third-line drugs. Because of the risk associated with their use, they're considered drugs that you would only use if you failed several of these other drugs. And it's often thought that these drugs are more effective than these drugs. That isn't true. And I'll show you a little bit of data. So this is just to emphasize that when you want to shut off the inflammatory attacks, which these are numbers of new MS plaques forming in the brain that drive the loss of brain volume. And so the more of these inflammatory attacks you allow, the more brain volume loss you lose, and the more that results in increasing disability over time. This is just summarizing what we now think of. So I've talked to you about the immunology. There's also this concept of neurological reserve. There's also brain volume loss. So this is a normal brain volume loss that we all have. This is brain volume loss for MS patients. It's much accelerated. And it's related to the amount of inflammatory disease, which is related to new MRI lesions. And those are related to the relapses. But only about 10% of new MRI lesions are associated with relapse. So that's a difference between them. And I would argue that the onset of progressive disease represents a point where we've used up the neurological reserve and we've unmasked the subclinical disease, and we also unmasked the effect of aging. And that explains why progressive patients respond the way they do to therapy. So our therapeutic goals have fundamentally changed in this last year. Our goals earlier were just to try to decrease the number of relapses and slow the rate of disability accumulation. But now we have therapies that actually allow us to shut off the disease essentially completely, as far as we can tell, in many patients. And for patients with relapsing remitting disease, that allows them to recover function. And that's what we were talking about this morning with the need for exercise. Exercise allows your brain to make new connections between the neurons you have. It also allows the brain to remyelinate, and that allows you to regain function. In relapsing remitting patients, they tend to get better. Progressive patients, they do slow down the rate at which they get worse. We may not be able to stop it totally because part of the progression is related to aging. Again, that's why exercise is so important. Exercise is the only treatment we have for aging along with the diet. So just one subtlety here. I mentioned that the drugs like Lemtrada or alemtuzumab, daclizumab, which are new drugs that are third-line drugs, they're often thought to be more effective than our second-generation drugs, but they're not. This is just one set of tables out of a recent paper that looked at about 5,000 patients on different drugs. And what it shows is that when you compare Tysabri to Lemtrada, both drugs reduce the relapse rates to about the same level. And that's true no matter what year you look at. And they also decrease the rate of disability progression about the same. So the green line here, or the blue line for you, is the Tysabri, and the red line is alemtuzumab. The fundamental difference is, though, the patients on Tysabri have a much better chance of actually improving function subsequent to treatment than the patients on Lemtrada. So even though Lemtrada decreases relapse rates to the same degree, it doesn't seem to have as much of a neuroprotective effect as Tysabri does. We think this is also true for ocrelizumab and rituximab. So these kind of subtleties are brand new in terms of thinking about these therapies, and they can have a big impact. And then finally, our clinical trials are going to be changing, we believe, and we're going to certainly try to drive that. We have very highly effective therapies for most patients in terms of shutting off the inflammatory attack. What we need to do is to help patients regain function, and we actually have opportunities to do that. So these are the different strategies one might use. One is to enhance remyelination of the brain, and there are a number of molecules that appear to have some capability of doing it. That's my phone telling me I'm overrun. Just shut up here. And then, but I think a more important issue for recovery function is actually number 2, number 3, and number 4. And that is we need therapies that actually inhibit the type 2 astrocytes, these pro-inflammatory astrocytes, and blocks the regulation of these toxic intermediates. In fact, we have therapies that, at least in our animal studies, has that capability. This includes Lipitor and other statins. And Lipitor and statins have been noted to preserve brain volume in MS patients, so we have history there. Another one is actually trying to minimize any further neuronal loss and normalize the rate of brain volume loss. And again, we have several molecules already out that might do that we could add to our highly effective anti-inflammatory therapies and focus specifically on what's going on in the brain. And then finally, we really want to enhance the ability of the brain to regain function by allowing the brain to make new connections. And we can do that through exercise. When you exercise and you activate your neurons, they make new connections. We might even be able to facilitate further by some other medications that might actually help neurons go through this process of neurite sprouting and rewiring. So the future of MS research isn't so much on immunological therapies now. We're now switching to reparative therapies. So we are at a tipping point in many different ways. And I would argue that if we use the therapies we have right now in the most effective way, and we diagnose patients early and treat them with most effective therapy early, in one generation, we can fundamentally change the outcome in terms of disability. In the future, we hope to be also able to reverse disability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vollmer. Great presentation. If you would like to hear from Dr. Vollmer in a more interactive, smaller setting, group setting, I invite you to attend our next Conversations on MS happening on June 7th in Boulder. So for more details and to RSVP, visit our website, mscenter.org. We often hear that patients have questions about which DMT is right for them and what things they should consider when they're thinking about DMTs. Dr. Robert Gross is here to discuss with us the available treatment options in our next presentation. Welcome, Dr. Gross.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me in the back? Good? No. How about now? Okay, good, thanks. Thank you all for coming, both people who came physically as well as our people who are joining us remotely. So the topic here is which disease-modifying therapy is right for me? So the first question to ask then is the obvious one, well, do I have MS? This might seem like pretty self-evident, but in fact, there are a lot of people out there who are being treated for MS who might not actually have MS. So that's a very good thing to establish first. And it's important because, well, for one, our medications, while in general quite safe, there is always a risk for a potential side effect, which would be avoided if you weren't on that medicine. And then at worst, there is the possibility that some medicines could make whatever disease you do have worse. So it's good to establish that you do in fact have MS. But what about these early forms of MS, something called clinically isolated syndrome? So you've had one attack that suggests that you have MS, but you don't yet meet our current criteria. Well, a lot of times we will actually end up treating these folks as though they have MS because we recognize that there is a high risk for developing new attacks. And as we know, there is already ongoing loss of brain volume. So it's something that we want to treat early and as effectively as we can. This is a slide that many of you are familiar with, breaking down MS into the different disease subtypes. We have relapsing remitting disease, which is what most people, when they get diagnosed with MS, get diagnosed with. There are relapses, which consist of abrupt worsening in symptoms, be they weakness, numbness, tingling, loss of vision, imbalance, what have you. And followed by usually a gradual improvement. Improvement might not be 100%, and they might be left with some residual deficits. And then in some proportion of patients who start with relapsing remitting disease, they will go on to have secondary progressive disease in which there's an insidious little by little worsening over time with or without superimposed relapses. And then finally, we have primary progressive disease. These are the folks who didn't start off with a relapsing remitting course, but instead just had the little by little worsening over time. And I put this slide in here to remind folks that when we looked at the vast majority of these drugs that I'm going to talk about, they were studied in relapsing remitting patients. So it's important to keep that in mind, although not all of them. And we'll get to that. So what is a disease-modifying therapy, or a DMT? Well, quite literally, it modifies or alters the course of the disease, MS. And how do we know that it does that? Well, we've studied them all in various clinical trials. And when we do clinical trials, what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for standardized measures of disease activity and disease progression. And so some of the most important measures that we're looking at are things like relapse rates, which we standardize by having it called an annualized relapse rate. In other words, if you have on average one relapse a year, your annualized relapse rate is 1. If you have one relapse in 2 years, then your annualized relapse rate is 0.5. If I have one relapse in 2 years and you have no relapses in 2 years, then the annualized relapse rate is 0.25. So that makes sense, right? The other things that are very important is changes on MRI, new or active lesions on MRI, as well as change in disability level, and EDSS, which I have a slide coming up to show you. This is kind of our most frequently used disability scale in clinical trials. So we look at all of these different outcome measures to determine whether an MS drug is, well, whether it is an MS drug, whether it is effective in treating patients with MS as opposed to a control. Now, these therapies are not meant to, in general, deal with ongoing symptoms. For that, we have separate treatments. We have symptomatic therapies for whatever symptom a person might happen to have, so fatigue, overactive bladder, gait impairment, et cetera. There are separate treatments, symptomatic treatments that we can use. Really, whatever works, we will try. And those treatments don't have really an impact on the overall course of the disease. And the disease-modifying treatments, with a couple exceptions that Dr. Vollmer just alluded to, probably aren't affecting the symptoms that a person might have at the present moment. And this is just to remind you that disease modification is just one aspect of what we hope to do to keep you happy and healthy. And of course, we have symptom management, which those were the symptoms I was just referring to, and then lifestyle interventions like our wellness initiative that you've heard about this morning. A brief note about steroids. So a lot of people ask me, well, where do steroids fit in? Well, I think of steroids as kind of in between a disease-modifying therapy and a symptomatic therapy. What do I mean by that? Well, steroids are very potent anti-inflammatory drugs. And in MS, we typically give them in very short bursts, so 3 to 5 days is the most common. And we give them either IV, which is the traditional way, intravenously, or by mouth, which is actually something that we've started doing recently and found that if you take the vial that you would otherwise use to give intravenously and you just dissolve it in water and mix it up with some juice, you can actually take it. Tastes a little bit, not very good, but you can avoid getting an IV placed. And we tend not to use steroids over long periods of time. We use them in the setting of an acute flare-up or an exacerbation because we think they hasten the recovery from that. But as it turns out, if all you're doing is giving steroids, I mean, this is basically what we had before we had our current disease-modifying treatments. We just basically had steroids, and people would get them periodically. Maybe some people would get them very frequently. But it didn't really seem to, people were kind of still getting worse. And so steroids alone are not going to cut it. So these are treatments that, again, Dr. Vollmer just alluded to some of the unmet needs that we have in MS, things like neuroprotection, remyelination, neural repair. I'm not going to discuss any of that today, but you will hear more about that from Dr. Corboy at his upcoming talk. And this is the EDSS, the Expanded Disability Status Scale. I put this in here just to remind you that, excuse me, so MS is very variable, and there are certainly some people who are up there at the top, with the tennis racket, and then there are other people who are more disabled, and everything in between. And so this is just to kind of remind you of the stakes of what we're dealing with. We want to try to avoid as much as we can the disability that happens. So if we can attack it, and we can attack it effectively and aggressively early on, then we can stand a chance at avoiding some of that stuff. And I think a very good chance. And now to the meat of the talk. So these are a timeline of the different disease-modifying therapies as they were approved in MS, from the very beginning with beta-seron in 1993, up through the most recent one with ocrelizumab or Ocrevus that was just approved a few weeks ago. Now, one thing about disease-modifying therapies in MS is that they're all immune-based. Obviously, MS is an autoimmune disease, as we've heard about. And what we're trying to do is get the immune system to regulate itself better and to stop attacking your brain and spinal cord. And so that's what the goal of these treatments are. In MS, we tend to use disease-modifying treatments singly, as in monotherapy, just one at a time. Whereas in other diseases, say diabetes or high blood pressure or what have you, oftentimes medications are combined. For the moment, we usually are not doing that. We are usually using one medicine at a time. So these are the first generation agents. These are all injectable agents, and I'll go into some of them into more in depth. We have glatiramer acetate and interferon beta. There are a couple different glatiramer acetate options and several different interferon beta options, including the most recently approved pegylated interferon, which is Plegridy, given subcutaneously once every 2 weeks. But these are all subcutaneous injections, and these were based from our very first disease-modifying treatments in the early 90s. And then our second generation agents, you've seen slides like this already, and then not our first-line agents, and we don't use these first-line agents because of the potential safety concerns associated with them. Mitoxantrone is associated with heart defects. Alemtuzumab is associated with the generation of new autoimmune diseases, and daclizumab can have some pretty serious skin conditions or lymph node conditions or liver conditions. Glatiramer acetate. So this is, I'm just going to go through some of the ones that we use most commonly in the clinic. So this is one of our first generation injectable agents. It's available as either Glatopa or Copaxone in the daily form, or it's available as Copaxone in 40 milligrams that's given 3 times a week. They're all subcutaneous. Overall, we think of Copaxone as being modestly effective. It reduces relapse rates somewhat, and it prevents some MRI activity. What we do know is that it is very safe in the long run. It's been around for a couple decades now, and it even seems to be safe during pregnancy, although of course most times during pregnancy we're not treating people for MS, but that's a discussion to have with your doctor. Common side effects associated with glatiramer acetate basically just mostly involve where you inject. You can get redness, pain, burning, itching. Rarely people can have this kind of immediate post-injection reaction where they get rapid heartbeat, flushed, anxiety kind of thing. It's not actually dangerous, and it tends to go away on its own within minutes. With prolonged use, we know that lipoatrophy can happen. That's little divots in the skin, and those can be unsightly. Tysabri came out in the mid-2000s, and it is an IV infusion given once every 4 weeks. We believe this to be very, very effective at preventing new MS disease. Generally, the infusions are very well tolerated. It's very rare that somebody tells me that they didn't tolerate their infusions. The one main safety concern with this is the risk of PML. PML I'll talk about in a second, but just to note that when we test for the virus that causes PML, the JC virus, and it's negative, then Tysabri remains a very safe option as long as the JC virus is negative. And this is PML. This is not a disease-modifying treatment. This is an infection, a nasty brain infection that we try to avoid letting people get. It's caused by the JC virus, which is a ubiquitous virus. More than 50% of us have been exposed to this virus. And it's something that we can test for in the blood. We test for the antibody to the virus. If somebody develops PML, so things to look out for if you're being treated, say, with Tysabri, new onset weakness, impaired vision, personality, or cognitive changes can happen. If any of those happen, you definitely want to talk to your doctor. This infection appears to be mostly associated with Tysabri, although we have seen a few cases with some of our other disease-modifying treatments. And we know that the risk does increase the longer a person is on Tysabri, and if they've had prior immunosuppression, like from chemotherapy, from cancer, or what have you. But that seems to really still only be in folks who've who've been exposed to the JC virus. Gilenya is our first oral DMT to become available. This came out in 2010. It's a once-a-day pill. We think of it as having pretty good effectiveness. And from a day-to-day perspective, it seems to be generally well tolerated. There are some safety concerns. They're rare-ish, but we should discuss them. The one thing is that at the very first dose, it can cause a slowing of the heart rate. Rarely is it something to a very significant degree, but for that reason, you have an EKG done before you start the medicine, and then you're monitored for the very first dose, usually for a period of 6 hours. Swelling in the back of the eye, macular edema, happened in about 1 in 300 in the clinical trials involving Gilenya. Can cause vision symptoms, or it can be more subtle. We check an eye test before we start, and then about 3 or 4 months after we start Gilenya. Gilenya has also been associated with an increased risk of certain infections or reactivations, so things like shingles, which is a reactivation of the chickenpox virus. And then, as I mentioned, there have been a handful of cases of PML associated with Gilenya, as well as potential other serious infections. But these things are fortunately quite rare. Aubagio is the second oral disease-modifying therapy to become available. How am I doing on time? Okay, well, we'll keep going. It's also a once-a-day pill. We think of the effectiveness of Aubagio as being modest, probably along the lines of the first-generation injectable agents. On a day-to-day basis, it's generally well tolerated. There can be some GI upset, there can be some hair loss, some people get numbness and tingling, but generally people say that it's fine. Safety concerns, it can affect the liver, and for that reason we actually check liver tests every month for the first 6 months of treatment. One reason why we don't really have too many folks on Aubagio is that a lot of our patients are younger men and women who of potential childbearing potential, and what we know about Aubagio is that it can potentially cause birth defects, and it sticks around in the system for a long period of time, and so that can be limiting in terms of its applicability. The most recent orally available disease-modifying therapy to come out is the Tecfidera. This is the only twice-a-day oral medicine. We think of this as having good effectiveness. I would say we probably have more issues with just general tolerability with this one, and they either fall into 2 categories. One is gastrointestinal, so nausea, upset stomach, bloating kind of thing, and the other is flushing. Usually, if you stick with it, you can kind of get over that initial hump after a few weeks if you get those symptoms, and we counsel patients to take it with a full meal to try to avoid the GI side effects, and there are other ways we can try to mitigate those symptoms. Safety-wise, we know that Tecfidera can lower the lymphocyte count, which is a type of immune cell that's important in MS. There have been about 5 cases of PML associated with Tecfidera, so there's there is a very rare risk for a serious infection, PML, but fortunately, it's not more than that. And then this is, I think, my last slide on disease-modifying therapies, rituximab and ocrelizumab. So ocrelizumab, you might have all heard, was recently approved for treatment of multiple sclerosis, and that was based on its really extraordinary clinical trial results, both in relapsing patients and in primary progressive patients. Ocrelizumab is new, however, it is very similar to, in the sense that it's the same mechanism of action as rituximab, in that they both target CD20 positive B cells, which you just heard about, and eliminates them from the circulation. They typically stay gone for about a period of 6 months. Therefore, infusions are given pretty much once every 6 months. In the case of ocrelizumab, the way it's been approved is that the first dose is split. So you get half the first dose on day 1 and the other half 2 weeks later, and then every 6 months after that, it's a single dose. We think of these medicines as having excellent effectiveness. Generally, they're well tolerated. Mild infusion-associated reactions, however, are fairly common. Swelling, itching, rashing, very rare rashes. Very rarely is it something more serious like kind of real allergic type reactions, swelling in the throat or chest tightness or something like that. You're being monitored while you have these infusions done. So ocrelizumab is the new one. Rituximab is the one that we've been using in our center for at least the past 8 or 9 years, and upon which we decided that ocrelizumab might be effective because we knew that rituximab was quite effective in MS. And so I don't think that there is necessarily a difference in effectiveness between the two. One, however, is being used off-label, the rituximab, and ocrelizumab is on-label. It's actually approved for MS. 2 more minutes, okay. We know that ocrelizumab is also effective in primary progressive MS in that it slows the rate of progression compared to placebo. This was really important results that we learned about recently, and was the very first disease-modifying therapy to show benefit in this population of MS patients. And this is just a slide to kind of go over a lot of the trials that have happened with MS disease-modifying therapies. It's a busy slide, so you don't have to worry about getting all the numbers right. But the one thing that everybody's eye is usually drawn to is the relapse rate reduction. And what you can see in those first few that involve the first generation of injectable agents, the relapse rate reductions were just very modest. And then once you got with Tysabri, you can see that up to 68% relapse rate reduction. And so our disease-modifying therapies got more powerful as we studied them for longer, and we got more different options. But one thing to point out is that if you're thinking about, which medicine is more effective, that these trials are all kind of different, and not just in the fact that sometimes you're comparing the medicine to a placebo, and sometimes, as in the more recent trials, you're comparing it to an active medicine like Avonex or Rebif. But also, even in the placebo arms, you can see that the relapse rates started at the very first trials at being above 1 per year, and then they started to go down, even in the placebo arm. To the point that they're now below 0.5. And so these trials are different, the patient populations are different, so you have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt in terms of if you're just going to be looking at relapse rate reductions. But of course, that's not all we look at. We look at other things like MRI changes and changes in disability scales, as I mentioned at the beginning. So how do we choose? You have medications that have different mechanisms of action. You have different side effect profiles. So there's a lot to think about. Fortunately, you don't have to come to this decision alone. You have your physician, and that's what we're here to help you with, trying to come up with the best medicine for you. And you're not wedded to any of these things. So if it doesn't work out for whatever reason, and these are some of the things you want to look for while you're on a disease-modifying therapy. Am I still having relapses? Is my disease just getting worse? Am I having side effects? Including, am I having more frequent infections? So these are things that you're going to want to look at while you're on treatment to see, is this treatment the right one for you? And if it's not, then we switch to a different treatment. And then you come in and we talk and we come up with a better option. what we do know about MS is, I know I'm running off over time, so what we do know about MS is that the characteristics do change over time, and this is similar to a slide that Dr. Vollmer showed. We know that relapse rates do go down over time to where they're at their greatest in the first decades of the disease, and then they kind of diminish every decade thereafter. And so we know that treatments are likely to be most effective in people soon after they're diagnosed, and then probably the benefits subside somewhat as people age. And so one thing we don't know is when it is safe to stop disease-modifying therapy. So that is actually why we're starting a trial called DISCO-MS, where we're taking folks who have been on disease-modifying therapy for at least 5 years and have been stable during that time, meaning no relapses, no MRI changes, that are at least 55 years of age, and then we're randomizing them, either continuing treatment or stopping treatment. And that way we'll know if stopping treatment produces the same results as continuing on treatment in this group. So this is going to be really important to try to get at when it is safe to actually stop disease-modifying therapy. And with that, I think that's it. So thank you very much for having me speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gross. That was great information. Dr. Vollmer mentioned that research is starting to look more about how we can repair and protect the nervous system. Dr. John Corboy will present next on some of the latest research aimed at reparative therapy, among other updates. Thank you very much, and don't forget to pass your questions towards the end of your aisle so that we can have the Q&A session after the conclusion of Dr. Corboy's talk. Thanks.
All right, am I on? Good. Thanks very much for coming and spending some of your precious Saturday morning beautiful weather outside in spring in Colorado time with us. Dr. Vollmer and Dr. Gross have both sort of introduced this topic, and especially Dr. Vollmer's last slide, and that is that there remains a substantial problem with the therapies that are presently available, and that is that they're very effective, especially early on during the course of someone's time with MS, especially when we think there's a lot of new inflammatory disease activity. But as Dr. Gross just showed you, the relapses tend to diminish over time. We know that active lesions on scans diminish over time. And we know from numerous studies that the benefits that are seen with the presently available disease-modifying therapies, including the new ones, are primarily directed against the inflammatory component of the MS. So there remains a great unmet need for those aspects of MS that have to do with the ongoing progressive nature of MS, especially as people age, and then also perhaps, can we somehow regenerate, can we repair, can we protect cells from dying as part of the aging process with MS, and that's what we'd like to focus on now. And here are my disclosures. And so I've really just sort of mentioned this, and this is what Dr. Vollmer talked about with cognitive reserve and brain reserve. That is, we can think of progressive MS, especially as aging transplanted onto MS and the normal aging process that we all undergo. We all have loss of brain volume as we age. We all have other things that happen to our joints and other parts of our body. And we can think of progressive MS as this aging process transplanted on top of that. And there's this loss of cognitive reserve and a disconnect between inflammation and progression with aging. So this is best seen perhaps in this. We know that brain volume loss starts early with MS, and it persists throughout the time that someone has MS. So that whereas inflammation and relapses and things like that diminish with age, that is not seen with what we think of as a very good marker of degeneration with MS. And therefore, there remains an urgent need for these other types of therapies, those that protect against demyelination and axonal loss. They promote remyelination or regeneration. And this is a variation of the cartoon that Dr. Vollmer showed before, a much older version, but still has the same general content. Just a couple things I might add. Here's the B cell function that Dr. Vollmer was referring to, its interaction with the T cells, the making of antibodies. Those antibodies may or may not be actually causing the problem in MS. And then here's the denuded, demyelinated axon, missing the myelin, and perhaps calcium influx participates in some of the damage that's going on here. He talked a little bit about some of these reactive oxygen intermediates, nitric oxide and others. Glutamate is a hyperreactive molecule potentially. all these coming out of macrophages, these scavenger cells that are in the nervous system after they've entered through the same way other cells have entered. But there are a number of things that are important in the concepts that we're talking about here. For example, there are a variety of molecules that are perhaps on the stumps or near the stumps of these axons that have been cut. And these block outsprouting of the nerves. It would be helpful if we could find some way to have them stop that or unblock that. Similarly, the oligodendrocytes that make the myelin wrapping that we can see in various locations here, these cells have precursor cells. I'm going to talk a little bit about stem cells in a few minutes. And differentiation of these cells into fully functioning oligodendrocytes is actually blocked by a molecule, actually several different molecules, but one well-known one called LINGO. Is there some way that we can block this blocker and allow these oligodendrocyte precursor cells to become fully functioning oligodendrocytes? So these are just a couple of examples of ways that we would potentially try and either protect cells from dying, for example, with calcium influx or glutamate effects or hyperactive reactive oxygen species, or to actually have repair with these cells that can then promote the full differentiation of the cells that would be involved with either making myelin or making the neuron itself. And so we'll start to talk a little bit about several of these. When you denude an axon, take the myelin off of it, this is what happens. Normally, when you transmit down a normal axon, the electrical potential, what happens is actually you have jumping of this electrical impulse from what's called node of Ranvier to another. And this is where all the sodium, potassium, calcium channels are that allow this jumping behavior to occur. When you denude this, that cannot happen easily. And the axon, this is actually a work from one of Tim's colleagues at Yale when he was there, Dr. Waxman, showed that you actually make more of these channels, these sodium channels, and this allows you to conduct down a partially damaged or demyelinated axon. And ultimately, if you truncate that, you don't really have that ability at all. But this is one of the compensatory reactions that occurs. But that's not necessarily a good thing when you have a partially demyelinated axon. It might help, but it doesn't fully function properly. And what happens, this is the axon again. And the green here are the so-called mitochondria. Mitochondria are the power plants of your cell. They make ATP. ATP is an energy source that's used for everything that your cells do, from maintaining just the membrane around a cell to all the activities in the cell, things that go in and out of the cell, or in the case of axons, transporting up and down the axon. And if you partially damage a myelin on a nerve, several things happen. One is some of these mitochondria will themselves get mutated and will be damaged, will not function very efficiently, will not make enough energy. But in addition, over time, this will cause failure in these. And you'll have just failure of the entire cell because you'll have an inadequate amount of energy available. Here's some of these, I mentioned these chronic active lesions that occurs. Ultimately, this will fail because you'll have inadequate production of energy. And what happens with these cells when you have the demyelinated axons is that the sodium, as opposed to being just at this node of Ranvier, it'll be along this entire denuded axon of a lot of sodium's coming in. Normally, the sodium will have to be pumped back out. It would be pumped back out right here. But it can't be pumped back out if you don't have enough energy. So you get an accumulation of sodium in here, and ultimately, you have accumulation in the opposite direction with calcium coming in as sodium itself just flows out naturally down a gradient of excessive sodium. This influx of calcium is very damaging to cells. If you could block that influx, that would potentially be quite helpful. So what are some of the things that we might want to do then? We might want to use antioxidants to try and get rid of these reactive oxygen species. And I'll show you some data with alpha-lipoic acid and simvastatin that gets at that possibility. You might want to decrease microglial activation and some of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, and that might be via laquinimod, for example. You might want to stop this influx of calcium with the effects of the sodium that I mentioned just in the last slide. When sodium is going out, calcium is coming inside the cell. And an old-fashioned anti-seizure medicine, Dilantin, has been studied to possibly show that. You might want to try to enhance this energy production of ATP with biotin, and I'll show you that data in a moment. And then finally, some of these cells will ultimately just die a normal natural death with so-called programmed cell death or apoptosis. There are some medications available which might try and block apoptosis, and actually erythropoietin, which is actually a normal portion of your body that is for the generation of red blood cells, might do that as well as promote some outsprouting of the nerves. So there are a variety of different approaches which might be helpful, and here's some of the data supporting these. So this is the simvastatin trial in secondary progressive MS patients. And what you can see is that what they looked at as their primary outcome measure was change in whole brain volume. And there was a substantial 50% reduction, placebo to simvastatin, in brain volume loss over 2 years. And that's shown here with less brain volume loss. In addition, they looked at clinical outcomes with what we call the MSIS total score, but also a more traditional scale that Dr. Gross noted, the EDSS scale. Individuals who are either stable or improved on the EDSS were substantially greater than in the placebo group. So both clinical and MRI measures, especially a substantial effect on brain volume with simvastatin. This is the alpha-lipoic acid trial. It was done in a relatively small number of patients. Here, just 51 patients. It was done at the VA by Rebecca Spain in Portland. This is not a young population. This is about 20 years older than most of the studies done in relapsing MS studies. These are real-life patients as they age with MS. And did a 2-year study, placebo versus those treated with alpha-lipoic acid, and a 66% reduction in brain volume loss in comparison to the placebo. And if you can note, that number of 0.22% loss per year is extremely close to what the average loss per year is in people without MS, which is somewhere between 0.15 and 0.2% per year. So that's a substantial effect. That's the largest effect that I'm aware of, especially in progressive MS patients. And if you just look at the brain volume losses that have been measured in the ocrelizumab primary progressive MS trial, 17.5%. The siponimab, and I'm not showing that study here, this is in secondary progressive MS, a very similar 23.4%. But here's laquinimod. This number actually, in a study that was just reported last week, was 40% in a second study. And then the simvastatin and the alpha-lipoic acid. These are showing profound effects on brain volume loss, presumably by mechanisms that have very little to do with an anti-inflammatory component. So this is some of the data with phenytoin or diphenylhydantoin, Dilantin, and this is in the animal model of MS, EAE. And when animals are just with the controls, this is normal animals. If this is just the density of the brain cells, the neurons that are seen in the motor tracts as well as in the sensory tracts. This is what happens in the animal model of EAE. This is in the spinal cord, showing substantial loss of the axons, the nerves in this preparation. But when you have EAE, but the animals have been treated with phenytoin, a substantial repair occurs, and these animals don't lose anywhere near the number of axons as the animals without the phenytoin. You can see that here and here in both the motor and the sensory tracts. Not quite as good as the control animals, but substantially greater than those who did not get the Dilantin. And so in humans, this has been looked at in a couple of different models. And this is actually in an acute optic neuritis model. These individuals who have an acute loss of vision in their eye, which many of you may have had before. And they looked at a variety of different outcomes. And I always have to walk over to look at it. But showed only a very modest benefit compared to placebo when you actually look at the retinal nerve fiber layer, the thickness of the optic nerve that's measured after the optic neuritis is there. So it's a little bit better than the placebo, but really not much. And both of those, you can tell, compared to the unaffected eye, they have lost in terms of measurement about 15 microns. Acutely, you can see that it's actually a little bit larger. It's swollen acutely. So this did not show much of an impact in acute model with an acute optic neuritis. But I'd say that the story is not yet out completely on phenytoin or Dilantin, and we'll see what future studies show with that. So this gets to, the next part gets to biotin. So biotin is a coenzyme. And it's a coenzyme in a variety of different reactions throughout your body, including so-called carboxylase reactions, and is active in a couple different places, here, and then down here, in what's known as the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is how you make ATP, the energy source for all these cells. And essentially, one way you can drive this cycle to make more ATP is to pump the substrate in, so succinyl-CoA or these other substrates that will then help drive this reaction that occurs like this, the so-called Krebs cycle, and make more ATP. So in theory, if you take biotin, it may help make more ATP. And so a study was reported last year from France, looking at 151 patients. You can see, actually 154, sorry, who were treated or placebo. And they looked at clinical outcomes. They had no MRI measures here, but they looked at clinical outcomes, people who improved on a 25-foot time walk or at least 1 point on that EDSS scale that Dr. Gross mentioned. And they showed in the double-blind phase, which was the first 12 months, and then in the extension phase over time, that a small but significant number of people actually improved in their function, either with the 25-foot time walk or the EDSS, or both. And you can actually see, so it was about ultimately about 15% of people improved. And after the first year, notably, people in the placebo group transitioned over, and they also improved over time. And you can see that a lot of these patients are patients with run-of-the-mill progressive MS. They all had progressive MS. You can see that their ages are quite consistent with a typically progressing population, a long disease duration, a high EDSS count, and they improved on the various outcome measures. And if you look at the average EDSS, there's actually an improvement and stabilization over the 2 years of the time. And this red line here is in comparison to numerous placebo outcomes in a variety of different treatment studies that have been done over time, showing that the average typically goes up as we expect with progression. But this is the group that was treated with biotin from the outset. This is the placebo group that went up a little bit, and then they stabilized. So this is now a study that we just got approval 2 weeks ago to do the second study. This will be now a 600-person study. Half will have primary progressive MS, half will have secondary progressive MS, age up to 65. And we'll be using MRI as well as clinical outcome measures for this study, which is essentially open now. This is a very complex slide that I'm actually going to skip. But this is just to show that with erythropoietin in an animal model, you can see that up here, that you can have salvage and you can have maintenance of axons in a variety of different locations in animals, in the animal model of MS, again, treated with erythropoietin in this case. And so erythropoietin has also been studied in, an acute model of optic neuritis. And there was less loss of the retinal nerve fiber layer, as you can see here. But there was no effect on acuity and no effect on visual evoked potentials. That's an electrical way that you can measure whether or not the myelin wrapping is working properly and essentially the speed of conduction, which is affected if there's demyelination. There is, however, a much larger study underway now in Germany, which is also going to be looking at, again, an acute optic neuritis model. There also is a study of erythropoietin in progressive MS patients. And there, again, a very small study, 24 in each group was completed. There were no differences in the primary composite outcome measure at 24 weeks. Again, mean age of about 50, both types of progressive MS, disease duration quite typical. And they looked at a variety of different primarily physical measures and unfortunately showed in this population there was really little, if any, benefit on multiple different measures. So this is being studied both in acute models with an optic neuritis as well as in progressive models with run-of-the-mill progressive MS as well. So far, in addition with this, lesion volume by MRI was not shown to be better. However, this was an extremely small study, only 24 in each group, considered a pilot study, and it was generally well tolerated. And actually, erythropoietin otherwise will just produce increase in red blood cells in your body. So that's trying to protect cells from dying, but then there are also potentially a bunch of ways you might want to enhance remyelination. And so I mentioned LINGO before. There's an anti-LINGO monoclonal antibody, opicinumab, which I'll show you a little data in a moment. There's another molecule called recombinant human IgM22, which may stimulate oligodendrocytes to produce more myelin. There are a variety of ways that you might stimulate differentiation of those normal precursor cells inside the brain and the spine to actually become those cells that will either remyelinate or which will actually cause outsprouting of nerves, especially mesenchymal stem cells may do that. I'll show that in a second. A variety of cells that may cause differentiation of oligodendrocyte precursors into fully functioning cells, and those are listed here, including erythropoietin. So far, the studies to date have been somewhat disappointing in humans, and I'll show you some of that data right now. But this concept that you can actually remyelinate or repair, when Dr. Vollmer and I were in med school, many of these cells, these precursor cells and other things we're talking about, we were told these didn't exist inside the adult brain and spine, but in fact they do, and using them may be appropriate. So this is the anti-LINGO, the opicinumab, in an acute optic neuritis model. This is just published recently by our colleagues from New York, Dr. Gillette and Dr. Balser. And in the acute model, in the intention to treat, that's taking all of the patients. They had an acute optic neuritis. They were treated with this molecule, and there was a small but not statistically significant benefit with less loss of retinal nerve fiber layer, as noted here. And notably, you can see here that that the loss of retinal nerve fiber layer thickness occurs extremely early, between weeks 0 and week 4. And this was notable because a lot of these patients didn't necessarily get treated immediately on day 1. And it's just a reminder that some of these effects can be quite substantial and quite damaging early. And you can see there's no difference between the treated and the untreated as they followed them over many different weeks. So let's talk about stem cells a bit. Stem cells, when we think of them, they're not necessarily always talking about the same thing. Stem cells are those cells that are single cells that can not only replicate themselves, but can then differentiate into many different cell types, including, for example, nervous system cells. And the key facts about these is that they can self-renew or differentiate, self-renew, differentiate. They enable the body to grow. The perfect stem cell, obviously, is a fertilized egg. It can become an entire human being. And there are generally three types of stem cells. Those that are actually in tissues, in the fetus or in the adult. Those that are taken from the embryonic stem cells, the so-called blastocysts or inner cell mass. And those that can be induced or taken from one body part and actually reprogrammed to become cells that can become different types of cells. And you can have totipotent, pluripotent, multipotent, oligopotent, unipotent. What this really refers to is the ability to differentiate becomes less and less and less and less as you go along this differentiation. And these are essentially the cells that then will only become one type of thing, like a skin cell or a nerve cell or a kidney cell. Whereas these that are up here, the totipotent ones, they can become anything. And so this is just a more graphic way to look at that. A single cell becomes pluripotent, multipotent, single potent. And these are the cells that then perform all the functions in your body. But they go through a normal natural development that occurs with cells coming and going and replicating and dying over time. And in a broad sense, the cells that are going to develop into the very functioning cells we're talking about come from ectoderm, mesoderm, or endoderm, these pluripotent cells. Here are the neural cells, the neural precursor cells. But here's, for example, the hematopoietic stem cell line. Mesenchymal stem cells also come out of that. And then these endodermal cells, which form a whole host of other things, internal gut problems, pancreas, gut, et cetera, that are involved in all your inner workings in the inner part of your body. So the point is, they start up here and they work all the way down here. So which stem cells are we talking about? And that's a very important question when you want to try and figure out what is actually potentially useful. And I'll just briefly mention the mesenchymal stem cells. Mesenchymal stem cells are part of that mesoderm, and these are very important cells because they can become a lot of different things, but as I'll show on the next slide, they have a number of properties that allow for repair, either anti-inflammatory or neurogenesis, blocking programmed cell death, and a variety of others. So these mesenchymal stem cells have the potential to do a significant amount of repair work. They don't necessarily go and become neurons or oligodendrocytes, but they can help repair them. And inside the nervous system, as you have a neural stem cell becoming more progenitor cell, becoming specifically neurons, oligodendrocytes, or astrocytes, the capacity for self-renewal diminishes. They'll go down this line to become differentiated, and they'll stop becoming the self-replicating stem cell. And ultimately, we'll have the different components of the nervous system that are noted there. So most of the time, when people are talking about stem cell studies that have been done, they're really talking about the bone marrow-derived stem cells. And most of the studies that have been done with the concept that you take stem cells from the bone marrow or from other sources, and you store them. And then you, by any of a variety of different techniques, will do what's known as high-dose immunoablation therapy, and you will remove the present immune system and stem cells, the bone marrow that exists in that person, and then so that they don't die, you replace them with the stem cells that you saved. And it's referred to as rebooting the immune system. And this is a recent meta-analysis done by this group here, just published a couple of months ago, over a prolonged period of time, multiple patients, 281 in different sites throughout Europe, relatively young age, many of them with progressive MS, and showed that half of these patients had progression-free survival at 5 years, which is actually pretty good. And if you look, the people who benefited the most, not surprising, because this, again, essentially is an immune system therapy, it's an immunotherapy, were younger patients, those who had relapsing disease at onset, and the number of MS treatments that were used were generally less, that just as a reflection of those individuals who were younger. So there have been numerous studies in multiple locations around the world showing that if you want to take this relatively extreme approach, especially in younger patients with very active inflammatory disease, it is effective. But the studies have also shown, unfortunately, it has very modest, if any, impact on those with progressive MS, as you can see down here. This is just another analysis of the same approach, but without the high-dose immunoablation therapy. This is from Richard Bird at Northwestern, again showing relapse-free survival, progression-free survival, and disease activity-free survival. And they again show the same thing, that the younger patients with relapsing MS benefited, those older patients with progressive MS did not. And so another way to look at this, a different meta-analysis looking at 764 patients from 15 studies, looking at the so-called NEDA that was referred to previously, no evidence of disease activity, followed these patients in all these different ones. The black line is the average, and here's a whole bunch of the different studies that are noted here, and suggests that the proportion of patients who have achieved NEDA after 2 years is 83%, which is actually quite good. And that's around in here. And that's actually quite good compared to a lot of the other therapies that are presently available. So for patients with highly active disease that you want to reboot the immune system, this approach is potentially useful. But what we're really talking about for most patients when we're talking about stem cells, we're often talking about patients who've already had some significant progression, and we want to try and repair the nervous system. And so I mentioned mesenchymal stem cells that may have that benefit. This is just a couple of the headlines from 2 different studies published in Lancet Neurology, and then this more recent paper in the MS Journal. This is from the Cleveland Clinic. And these are pilot studies looking at mesenchymal stem cells, the concept being that you would do no immunoablation whatsoever, but you would just simply transplant the patient's own mesenchymal stem cells, actually just IV. The hope would be that they would be able to traverse into the nervous system and stimulate some repair. So oftentimes when people are saying, well, I'm going to go to Guadalajara and I'm going to get stem cells, it's probably more likely that what they're getting is this. And this is just, I put this up here mostly for myself to remind me, this is a really good review paper on all of the different approaches to stem cells. This guy, Stefano Pluchino, has done a variety of the basic science work with this. This is from a group in New York, Dr. Sadiq, who's actually gone to the next step, which is the first that I'm aware of that is looking at a different way to look at repair. He's looking at taking mesenchymal stem cells, but those that have been stimulated to then have properties that have differentiated down the road towards becoming neural stem cells. And he's then taken these neural stem cells and put them into the spinal fluid, directly into the nervous system, essentially, and then followed these patients for a period of time. There's a small number of patients that have been studied in this fashion, and this is looking at the EDSS. This is pre-transplant, this is transplant, and this is what happens to the EDSS over time. Higher is worse, and so this patient worsened somewhat, this person was stable, this person worsened somewhat, this person was stable after the transplant, et cetera, et cetera. So what this, I put this slide up, the purpose of which is to say that it's not exactly clear what cells we're talking about, where you're going to put them, what our expectations are for what they're going to do. And so I think we still need to learn a lot about the stem cells, and we'll learn more as we try different techniques. With ALS, people are using embryonic stem cells and injecting them directly into the spinal cord at multiple locations up and down the spinal cord, because in ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, we know exactly where the cells are that are lost, and they're injecting them directly into what's known as the anterior horns. The concept here is that we have a lot of different issues to deal with. Which stem cells to use, where do you put them, and what are expectations for them, and even will they survive, and having other measures that we'll look at to measure how someone improves or how these are potentially beneficial. So this is just my last slide. I'd like to thank you all for coming. We're going to have all of the presenters come back up, and we'd be happy to answer questions. Dr. Vollmer has been assiduously picking through all of them to try and pick out all the different questions. And thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Dr. Corboy. Great presentation. We would like to welcome the doctors back up for our Q&A section of the program. Dr. Schreiner, Dr. Vollmer, Dr. Gross, and Dr. Corboy will be up at the front to answer the questions that you've already submitted, and Dr. Vollmer will be coordinating the Q&A session. So thank you again for being here.
Might have to turn it on. Thanks.
Let it warm up here.
There you go.
So we recognize that we're running over, so we'd like to be efficient here. So I'd like to ask my colleagues to try to control their natural behavior and try to be succinct in the answers.
Succinct.
Okay. I'm just going to run through a couple ones that are fairly short. We have a question online from Rick about simvastatin. There's no evidence that simvastatin is bad for MS. In fact, there is evidence that it might be helpful, as Dr. Corboy mentioned. And so at this point, we're looking forward to actually more clinical trials to try to clarify this, but there's no need to worry about simvastatin making MS worse. Second question was alternatives to ibuprofen. This is a more complicated issue. As you know, in the news, it was reported recently that this may increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, and particularly heart attacks. The effect is really quite small. Tylenol is actually a more dangerous drug in terms of over-the-counter drugs because of the acute liver failure that it tends to cause. So it's something to discuss with your primary physicians about. At this point, the recommendation is just to use it when you need it, but don't take it when you don't need it. So don't take it on a regular basis just because it's a habit. Another question is about salt intake, about how to inform you about your salt level. Basically, you can do a dietary diary for your diet and just look at how much you're taking in. The other way is you can look at the amount of salt that's excreted in your urine. Again, for most of it is high, so I would do the dietary diet or the diary for the diet first. And the question is sugar, are the studies showing that sugar is bad for MS? Yes, but not directly. The problem with sugar is not so much that it changes the biology of MS, but that it induces other diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and obesity, which then damage the brain in addition to the MS, and that multiplies the disability that patients have. So it's very important to follow the guidelines that you heard earlier today. And a question about natural antioxidants like blueberries. They're great with strawberries and bananas, and definitely recommend that you should eat as many as you can. And a question about eggs. Eggs are not quite the demon that was, we were told back in the 90s. They're a very good source of protein. Eggs that are particularly raised in a more natural way with better food qualities actually have a fair amount of vitamins and nutrients in the yolk as well. And so in moderation, they're a reasonable part of your diet. So I have a question. I'll give this one to Dr. Schreiner. The question is about hormone supplementation, i.e. testosterone or progesterone pellets in perimenopausal women, and their effectiveness in rebuilding muscle mass with exercise. Well, basically, there have been some studies done looking at androgenic hormones like testosterone to try to help build muscle mass in people with various disabilities. They were small studies, and the major conclusion was that they could increase muscle mass, but as soon as the patient went off the hormones supplementation, they lost the muscle mass. So at this point, there's not a clear role for it, rehabilitation. That might change in the future as new molecules come up.
The only thing I would add is that hormones have a lot of other properties, especially estrogen. And estrogen is helpful for maintaining bone function and a variety of other things. There's some evidence that estrogen subtypes may be beneficial for MS, although that's certainly not conclusive. And we, of course, know that pregnancy and perhaps breastfeeding are somewhat beneficial for MS. So hormones are complicated. What role they play in the fact that women are much more affected by MS than men is not clear. So I think there's still a lot more to learn about testosterone and estrogen.
We have several questions related to vitamin D. Maybe Dr. Grossi would take this one. So the question is how often should vitamin D levels be checked? What is the dosing schedule, and how does it correlate with blood levels? And what is considered a maintenance dose of vitamin D?
Good questions, all. So, you know, our lab has guidelines as to what normal levels of vitamin D are, and what it includes as the lower limit of normal is actually lower than I would generally advise people to have. I think that having a level in your blood of at least 35 is a good way to start. So we can test it in your blood, and then if it's below that level, then we can supplement. And I'd say on average, most people can get away with getting 3,000 to 5,000 units of vitamin D every day to bump up their level to a good level. If the level is quite low, then we might, and that you can get over the counter. If the level is quite low, then we can do a prescription vitamin D of 50,000 units every week, which is a pill once a week to bump it up. And then a few months later, we can recheck and see did it respond as we think it should. So vitamin D, obviously there's a lot about vitamin D in MS. Low vitamin D seems to put people at increased risk for MS. There's been work that suggests that MS patients who have lower levels of vitamin D might have higher rates of activity, disease activity. Whether supplementation is actually beneficial in MS, it's controversial at this point. Some studies seem to indicate that it might be helpful, but since it's really benign and it's very, I've never seen anybody have adverse reactions from vitamin D, we generally encourage people to supplement if they are at all low.
And I'll just add one thing, which is that vitamin D has a very, very long half-life. And so I recommend testing vitamin D only 2 times per year. You can test it more frequently if you are taking active steps to try and change the level, but it has such a long half-life that it isn't something that you need to check very regularly.
That's a good point, yes. Yeah, I usually don't check it, every time somebody comes. I might check it once or twice a year. Yeah.
This next set of questions are open to all of you. They're all related to rituximab and ocrelizumab. So one question is, when do the infusion reactions occur? Are they during the infusion or do they come later? How does the cost of the drug compare to other DMTs? Are insurance companies approving ocrelizumab? And are you recommending your patients switch from rituximab to ocrelizumab?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll talk about the infusion reactions first, and then maybe my colleagues
Sure.
can help with the rest. So what we've seen in rituximab, which seems similar in ocrelizumab, is that about 1 in 3 people will have an infusion reaction during the time that the medicine is actually being infused. And this seems to be more common in the first infusion, or the first couple tends to get better, in other words, with the number of infusions that you've had. The infusion reaction itself can be sweating, getting hot, feeling uncomfortable, a feeling of malaise, rarely scratching, throat, swelling of the throat. The infusion reactions are treated by stopping the infusion, giving Benadryl and/or steroids, and then resuming the infusion at a slower rate. And most of the time, the patient is able to complete the infusion.
Rob?
Yeah, remind me what the questions were again.
Maybe you could talk about, in terms of, would we recommend patients switch from rituximab to ocrelizumab?
Yes. So as I mentioned during my talk, I don't have good reason to believe that rituximab or that ocrelizumab is necessarily a more effective medicine than rituximab is. They're both very, very effective in MS. I think that it's a discussion about switching. What we know is that because the rituximab is not FDA approved for MS, sometimes we're not able to necessarily get it approved by patients' insurance companies, and so that can lead to denials and then appeals, and during that time you're not getting the medicine that you want to get. And so from an insurance point of view, the ocrelizumab might make more sense. Now, if you're already on rituximab and it is approved, then and you're tolerating it well and all that, and financial considerations are not significant, then you could potentially continue it. Now, we do have a study where we're investigating people who have been on rituximab and are going to be switching to ocrelizumab. Compare those folks to people who are on rituximab and continuing on rituximab to see, is there a difference in terms of how well people tolerate one versus the other. We don't know for sure yet. There might be a difference or there might not be. Anything else to?
No, I would just add that we're still waiting to hear from many of the insurance companies as to what their response will be with two aspects of either covering or not covering ocrelizumab. First, will there be so-called step edits where they require that people fail 1, 2, or more drugs before they will pay for ocrelizumab? This is common. Step edits are very common in our world and also in the rest of medicine. And some have, even though it's approved as a first-line agent, as Dr. Vollmer noted, some insurance companies have already shown that they will have step edits, others have not. That's one component. The second component is that all of the medicines that we've been using have dramatically increased in price over the course of the last 15 years or so. However, the price is not necessarily what insurance companies pay. The wholesale price is not what they pay. There are a substantial number of rebates, reductions, and other changes that occur before the actual price is paid. And how that's going to work with ocrelizumab is not clear. The company has said that the number that they have listed as their cost is their cost. However, even after that is that they're not going to do rebates and reductions, but that number is substantially below the wholesale cost of all of the other medications. Parenthetically, rituximab is probably 1/5 of that cost. But the problem is that we will not really know what's going to happen with other companies when they adjust their prices, because those are not transparently changed. And then in addition, when you go for the infusion, there are markup costs. The wholesale cost is one thing, but there are markup costs at the infusion centers, and then, of course, the cost of the infusion itself. So that's the long answer to, we have no idea what people pay for these medications. You want me to take this one?
Just one.
Okay.
There's a question about, does Tysabri only block T cells, or does it also affect B cells? It's actually been known for some time that B cells actually express more of the molecule that Tysabri is targeting, and it does block B cell migration to the brain just as effectively as it does T cells. So again, it's consistent with the concept we've been discussing that B cells are the major driver. Dr. Corbett?
So this is a question: what can we do to proactively take steps to decrease the risk of our children getting MS, and should we have them get MRIs at a certain age? And so what this gets at is that there are a number of known risk factors related to development of MS. We've discussed some. Vitamin D is one, smoking, post-adolescent obesity, and genetic factors, and a variety of other things, exposure to Epstein-Barr virus. But perhaps the most profound is that there's about a 10 to 20-fold increased risk of first-degree relatives, either children or siblings of those with MS, of developing MS. And that number goes up the more affected family members there are that are involved. And so in part to address this question, we are about to embark on a study which we refer to as RISE MS, Risk Factors in Early MS. The general approach will be to look at individuals 18 to 30 who are asymptomatic, but who have a first-degree relative, either a parent or a sibling, with multiple sclerosis, and to do MRI scans on all of these individuals, but a very abbreviated MRI scan, about a 15-minute MRI scan, no dye. The purpose is just to see, are there lesions that look like MS or not? And these are all people who are not patients, they have no symptoms. We'll also at the same time gather a very intense environmental screen having to do with medicines that they take, activities that they do, dietary issues, and a variety of other things, and draw blood as well for some of the known risk factors, for example, vitamin D levels, as well as to try to investigate potential factors that we don't know about. We may also take a stool as well for this. The so-called microbiome may be a clue to what's going on with risk factors in development of MS. So the purpose of this is to try to identify individuals at the earliest possible phase with MS, that is when they just have MRI markers, so-called radiologic isolated syndrome, but also to potentially identify those things that may be alterable or changeable. We can't change our genes necessarily, but we may be able to change other things that would be relevant to developing MS. So trying to develop a risk algorithm for those individuals who may develop MS and utilizing those who are at highest risk to try to get at that. Ultimately, of course, you'd like to use this for anybody who does or doesn't have a risk of MS, just like we screen everybody for colon cancer or for breast cancer or whatever else. In a similar fashion, you could potentially screen everybody if you developed a risk algorithm.
And I'll just add one thing. So if you have MS and the question of what kind of interventions you might make with your kids, well, certainly you're going to want to encourage them to eat a healthy diet, exercise regularly. We have some evidence that obesity in children and adolescents contributes to an increased risk in developing MS. And then, in addition, you might want to talk to your kid's pediatrician about whether it makes sense to supplement with vitamin D.
And reinforce no smoking, ever.
There's a question about can you get rid of the JC virus or PML. We don't have any specific treatment for PML once it starts. It's mainly to withdraw the therapies and try to reestablish the immune system in order to terminate the infection, but it has variable outcomes. In terms of the JCV.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I thought you were done, I apologize. I was just going to say there's no vaccine available as yet, and no one's working on a vaccine that I'm aware of.
There's a couple companies I know that are working on antiviral drugs that might work, but I haven't heard that's gone anywhere so far. So no, there's no way to really change your status if you're infected. So this is one for all of you. What are the long-term health risks of Tysabri or rituximab/ocrelizumab, and what is long-term when dealing with MS?
Go ahead.
Okay, well, long-term risks of Tysabri. The number one risk that we think of is the risk of this brain infection PML. And we know that that risk increases the longer that you've been on the medication, particularly if you are JC positive. If you have been exposed to this virus, the John Cunningham virus, and you have a titer of antibodies, a certain number of antibodies in your blood, then your risk of this brain infection goes up with time. Now, that being said, if you have not been exposed to this virus, if you don't have the antibodies, we see that people can be on this medication indefinitely and tolerate it very well and continue to benefit from it. With rituximab, that's a slightly tougher question to answer because a lot of our long-term data about rituximab comes from patients with other diseases, comes from rheumatoid arthritis, comes from patients with B-cell lymphomas. They have been using rituximab for a lot longer in those diseases, and they have the indication for that, than we have been using them for MS. But those patients are not the same as MS patients. Those patients have also been treated with chemotherapeutic agents, with other immune suppressants, oftentimes many and at the same time. So what we see in those patients is there does seem to be an increased risk of cancer the longer you've been on rituximab. We don't know. Is that because of the rituximab, or because it's been used in conjunction with 6 other things, or because the nature of the disease itself? But that is something that we have observed in that patient population. There is a risk with rituximab also of developing antibodies to the drug itself that can not only prevent it from working, but can give a different type of infusion reaction, an allergic reaction during the course of the infusion.
With ocrelizumab and all of the studies involving ocrelizumab, there were 6 women who were diagnosed with breast cancer, 6, I believe. Breast cancer, unfortunately, is very common in women. Some 1 in 8 will develop it in their lifetime. So we don't know for sure whether that's going to be a real safety signal yet or not. Otherwise, it looked like the risk for cancer just with ocrelizumab seemed to be about on par with other MS cohorts who had not gotten that medicine. So we'll need to do more surveillance.
We've got 2 groups of questions left. I'll let Dr. Corboy go first.
This is just a simple one about doses. I mentioned biotin and alpha-lipoic acid. In the studies that were mentioned, the alpha-lipoic acid was 1,200 milligrams a day, which I think is higher than you'd be able to easily get in a health food store. You'd probably have to go to a compounding pharmacy to get alpha-lipoic acid that high, or take quite a few of the pills. The biotin was 300 milligrams a day. The original study was 150 twice. The second study is going to be 100 milligrams 3 times. If you go to a health food store, you can typically get 5 or maybe 10 milligram tablets. So you can go to compounding pharmacies. One of them is highdosebiotin.net. It's just a pharmacy. There's no prescription required. And for roughly $50, if you do 3 months at a time, they will mail 100 milligram tablets to your house. You would take 3 per day of the biotin. And again, these are preliminary studies. I don't want to certainly be giving the impression that this is proven dogma that we would use these, but I think the data is stimulating, is quite interesting, and that's why a second larger study, much larger study, better controlled study, is being done now with the biotin.
So there's several questions about the patients developing new symptoms, yet their MRIs remain stable. Thing I would just tell you is that the MRI is not the gold standard for new lesion activity. It does detect some of them, but unfortunately a lot of disease activity occurs in the bed of old MS plaques, so they don't show up as a new spot on the MRI, and unfortunately we're still by and large gestalting or looking at the number of white spots. In addition, the MRI does not detect all lesions that occur even if they are a new spot, particularly in the spinal cord. We believe it misses about 50% of the lesions that are actually there based on pathological studies. So the more important thing is actually what's happening to you, and your clinicians need to listen to what you're telling them and then use that information to help you deal in terms of selecting what the best therapy is for you. And then there was a question about, for me, in terms of B-cell mutation in response to the various DMTs. At this time, we don't really see any evidence that the current DMTs are changing the production of these B cells from the deep cervical lymph nodes, and doesn't appear to be inducing any new mutations that we know of. That's a little bit hard to know, but they also suggest would genomics be helpful. I think genomics and proteomics and other omics studies that are available now might be helpful in ultimately helping us monitor these cells and see how they change over time and maybe help us identify additional strategies for treatment. And then one question, does anybody know, are high levels of iodine in the body an issue for MS?
High levels of
Iodine.
iodine?
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean it's not. I've never heard that, though.
Now, the most important question so far, what about almond milk? Healthy or not, unsweetened?
I say yes. At least one doctor says yes.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your interest, and if there's other ways we can be helpful, please let us know.
Have a great day. There you go. That's a first.